Hello, my friend. Come in, get yourself settled. Pull the blanket up just a little higher, let your shoulders drop and let the rest of the world wait outside for a while. Tonight we're going somewhere quiet. Somewhere lit by candlelight, cold at the edges and warm in the middle the way a good story should be. Because tonight I want to tell you about a moment that happened inside almost every home across 16th century England somewhere between midnight and dawn. A moment where an ordinary person opened their eyes in complete darkness, fully awake, and felt no fear at all. Not because of a bad dream, not because of a sound outside the window. They simply woke up. And if that has ever happened to you somewhere around 3 a.m, staring up at the ceiling wondering what is wrong with you, by the end of tonight's story I think you will feel very differently about that quiet hour. But before we slip inside that little room together, I want to ask you for something small. If stories like this one ever help you unwind, or if they have kept you company on a night when your own mind would not slow down, a quiet like on this video helps far more than you would guess. And staying with me so you do not miss the next story means a great deal to me. And if you have a moment, tell me down in the comments where you are watching from tonight and what time it is on your clock right now. I love picturing all these different corners of the world all quietly gathering for the same story at once. Now if you can turn the lights down low, maybe let a soft fan hum somewhere behind you, and let's step into the past together. Picture a small house somewhere outside London in the middle of the 1500s. The walls are made of woven branches packed with clay and straw, the kind of wall a family could raise in a few days with their own hands and their neighbours' hands too. The roof is thatch, thick and golden in daylight, but tonight it is only a shape against a sky with no city glow to soften it, because there is no city glow yet, anywhere. It is late autumn, and outside the kind of chill that finds every gap in a timber frame has settled over the whole village, home after home, family after family already deep in the first hours of a night that will last far longer than any of them would choose. Inside, a woman lies on a mattress stuffed with straw under a blanket that smells faintly of wood smoke, because everything in this house smells faintly of wood smoke. Beside her, the coals in the hearth have gone from orange to a dull breathing red. A single rush light, already burned down to almost nothing, throws one last small orange glow against the wall before it gives up entirely, and the room settles into a near total dark broken only by the faint red heartbeat of the hearth. And somewhere near midnight, without any particular reason at all, her eyes open. She does not sit up in a panic. She does not reach for anything. She simply lies there for a moment listening to the quiet. Maybe she can hear her husband's slow breathing beside her. Maybe a dog shifts near the door. Maybe somewhere outside an owl calls once and then stops. After a while she gets up. Not to start the day, not anywhere near it yet. She might kneel for a few minutes and say a prayer, the same one she said every night of her life. She might quietly poke at the coals just enough to keep a small flame breathing until morning. She might sit by the window if the shutter is open a crack and simply think about the next day's work, about a friend who is unwell, about nothing in particular at all. And then after some time, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, she climbs back under the blanket and falls asleep again, easily, without any struggle, and in the morning she will not remember this as a bad night, because to her it was not a bad night, it was simply a night. And this was not only true inside a small cottage like hers. Step inside the grandest palace in the land, and you would find the very same rhythm playing out, only dressed in finer clothes. Attendants would comb the king's hair, ease him into his night clothes, and settle him into bed before lighting a single small night light meant to burn low until morning. His candles were beeswax instead of rush, and his rooms were larger and warmer and far better guarded. But when midnight came and his own eyes opened in the dark for no particular reason at all, The King of England was in that one narrow hour doing exactly what the woman in the small house down the road was doing. Lying quietly awake, waiting for sleep to find him again. Here is the part that I find so moving. This was not unusual for her. This was not some private secret she carried, wondering if something in her was broken. This was simply how a night worked for almost everyone in almost every corner of England for hundreds of years before electric light ever existed. Historians who study the written record of the past court papers, personal letters, old medical books keep finding the same pattern over and over, described so plainly that the people writing it down never once thought to explain it, the same way you would never stop to explain what breakfast is. They called it a first sleep and a second sleep, two separate rests with a quiet waking hour tucked in the middle almost every single night. For some households, that quiet waking hour carried a purpose beyond simple rest. Long before the Tudor age began, monks had risen in the middle of the night for a service of prayer, a tradition stretching back many centuries, even after England's monasteries were shut down, and much of that formal religious life swept away the habit of rising quietly in the dark to pray, or simply to reflect, lingered on in ordinary homes. A woman might use those 20 minutes to say a private prayer for a sick neighbour or a husband and wife, might talk softly about a worry neither of them wanted to raise in front of the children by daylight. The middle of the night, it turns out, has always been a strangely honest hour. Some writers of that century even admitted quietly that this waking hour was their favourite part of the whole day. No chores waiting, no visitors knocking, no daylight distractions pulling their attention in 10 directions at once. Just the fire, the dark, and a mind finally left alone with itself. And when you really think about why this pattern existed at all, it starts to make a strange kind of sense. There was no way to simply push back the dark for as long as you wanted. Light in a Tudor home was something you earned. A rushlight made from a reed dipped in animal fat gave off a small smoky flame that lasted only a few minutes before it needed to be replaced. Beeswax candles burned longer and cleaner, and smelled faintly sweet instead of like a dinner nobody ordered, but they cost far more than most families could spend. And on top of that, they were taxed. Families would often spend an entire autumn afternoon together, peeling reeds and dipping them again and again in melted fat, making enough rushlights to last through the whole dark half of the year. It was tedious work, and it smelled faintly of the kitchen for days afterward. But it meant that even the poorest household had at least a little light standing by for the nights, when the dark refused to feel restful at all. So most homes, rich or poor, burned as little light as they possibly could once the sun went down, which meant in the depths of an English winter a person might be lying in the dark for 14 hours or more waiting for morning. Nobody's body is built to lie still and unconscious for 14 straight hours. So it did not. It rested, woke gently in the middle, sat with the quiet for a while and rested again. There is a small piece of language left over from this world, one you've probably said yourself without ever thinking about where it came from. The word curfew comes from an old French phrase that simply meant cover the fire, because in a village built almost entirely from timber, straw and thatch, an unwatched flame left burning through the night was not a cosy detail. It was a real danger. So each evening a bell would ring, and households would bank down their fires just enough to keep a few coals alive until morning, and settle into that long dark stretch of night together. I have to be honest with you. When I first came across all of this, I laughed a little in a good way, because somewhere in the 16th century, a woman woke up at 3 a.m, sat quietly with her thoughts for 20 minutes, and went right back to sleep without a single ounce of worry about it. And here we are, centuries later, with soft mattresses and blackout curtains and noise machines, shaped like little clouds lying awake at 3 a.m, reaching for a glowing phone, absolutely convinced that something is wrong with us. There is even a name for it now in modern sleep medicine. Doctors call it sleep maintenance insomnia, and there are entire clinics, mattresses, and glowing wellness apps built around curing it. But when you place that modern worry next to a woman calmly praying by candlelight in the middle of the night 500 years ago, without a single ounce of anxiety about it, you start to wonder whether the problem was ever the waking itself. Maybe the real difference between her night and ours is not what happens in the dark. Maybe it is simply what we've been taught to think about it. Maybe nothing is wrong with either of us. Maybe we're just doing what people have always done in a world that has simply forgotten to expect it anymore. That to me is the quiet lesson tucked inside this one small habit. We were never promised 8 unbroken hours in a single tidy block. That idea is newer than you might think, born mostly from clocks and shift work, and electric light convincing us that night should behave like a light switch instead of a season. But long before any of that, people trusted the dark. They let it hold them for a while, woke gently inside it, and were not afraid of what they found there. Just their own breathing, their own thoughts, a few dying coals and the quiet. There was no glowing screen promising an answer for why they were awake. There was no urge to check the time because in most homes there was no clock ticking away in the dark to check in the first place. There was only the night itself, patient, ordinary, and strangely kind. So the next time you find yourself awake in the middle of the night staring at the ceiling for no reason at all, I hope some small part of you remembers that woman in her little house of woven branches and clay. She was not broken. She was simply having a very old, very human kind of night, one that people were having long before her, and one that it turns out we are still quietly having now, whether we admit it or not. But once her second sleep finally came and the first grey light began creeping in through the gap in that shutter, a whole new set of habits was waiting for her. Habits that had nothing to do with rest and everything to do with a question that might sound simple, but was not simple at all for a person living in that century. Somewhere outside, a rooster tested its voice, a bucket knocked against the side of a well, and the village slowly began to breathe again. And once this ordinary woman woke for good, there was one question waiting for her before a single bite of food ever touched her lips. A question about a drink that sat in nearly every home in the land morning after morning, and another very common drink that most people would go entire weeks without touching at all, for reasons that once you hear them will make complete sense. That bucket knocking against the side of the well was not there so anyone could fill a cup and drink straight from it. Not really. Water pulled up cold and clear from a village well could look perfectly harmless to a person standing there in the grey morning light, and that in its own strange way was part of the problem. Somewhere behind her in that same small kitchen, a wooden jug already sat waiting near the hearth, filled the evening before with something pale gold and slightly cloudy. She would pour a cup from it without a second thought, the same way you might pour your own coffee without stopping to consider why a coffee pot sits on your counter instead of a jug of plain tap water. It was simply what a morning looked like. Here is what almost nobody tells you correctly about this particular Tudor habit, and I only found it out after digging through more sources than I expected to need. There is a popular version of this story floating around online, the one where clever medieval and Tudor folk supposedly figured out that water carried invisible sickness, so they cleverly switched to alcohol instead. It sounds tidy, it sounds almost modern, and it is not quite what happened. Nobody in that century had any concept of a germ. Nobody was thinking in terms of bacteria or contamination, or anything you and I would recognize as science. Their reasoning ran along a completely different track, one built on an old medical idea that had shaped European thinking for more than 1,000 years already. The idea that the body was governed by a balance of qualities hot and cold, wet and dry. Water in that old framework was considered cold, and a cold drink taken into a cold body was thought to unsettle the whole system. I, on the other hand, was considered warm and nourishing, something that steadied a person rather than upsetting them. So when a Tudor physician warned a patient away from water, he was not thinking about invisible microbes swimming in it. He was thinking about balance and temperature and humours in a system of medicine that would look almost as foreign to us as ours would look to him. Funnily enough, we have not entirely let go of that instinct ourselves. Walk through any wellness aisle today, and you will still find people swearing that warm water with lemon is somehow gentler on the body than a cold glass straight from the tap, with no more scientific backing than a Tudor physician had for his own theory of hot and cold humours. We simply dressed the same old instinct in new language, and yet underneath that mistaken reasoning, something real and useful was quietly happening anyway. In most Tudor towns, water sources were not exactly inviting to begin with, whatever the medical theory said about them. Rivers ran past tanneries and butchers and washing yards before they ever reached anyone's cup, and wells dug too near a privy or a pigsty picked up more than anyone wanted to think about. People did not need a microscope to notice when water tasted foul, looked cloudy, or carried a smell that made a person's stomach turn before a single sip went anywhere near their mouth. Plain unpleasantness, not any theory of disease, kept a great many people away from the worst of it, long before anyone understood exactly why that instinct was worth trusting. Then there was the drink they reached for instead, and this is where it gets interesting. Making ale required grain to be soaked, sprouted dried and mashed into a thick, sweet liquid called wort, which was then left to ferment with yeast for several days. Nobody in a Tudor kitchen boiled that wort to kill anything invisible, because they did not know anything invisible was there to kill. But the process of brewing, quite by accident, still managed to knock down a good number of the very same troublemakers that made bad water dangerous in the first place. They stumbled onto something that worked centuries before anyone could explain why it worked, purely by making a drink they liked the taste of. Can I ask you something while we're on the subject? Have you ever done something out of pure habit, some small routine, you never really questioned and only found out years later that it happened to be protecting you the whole time for reasons you never once considered? That is more or less what an entire country was doing morning after morning for generations. There is a small habit tied to this drink that has survived all the way into our own kitchens and dining rooms, even though almost nobody remembers where it came from. It was common practice to drop a small piece of toasted bread into a cup of ale, or wine, partly to soak up some of the sharper, sourer flavours, and partly because stale bread was never wasted in a Tudor household, if there was any use left in it at all. Over time, sharing a cup in someone's honour, wishing them good health, before taking a drink simply became known by the name of that floating piece of bread. The next time you lift a glass at a wedding or a birthday, and someone calls it a toast, you are echoing a habit born from a soggy piece of bread in a cup of ale 5 centuries ago. Ale itself was not one single drink either. A household would take that first thick mash and brew it, producing a strong ale saved for special days and honoured guests. The very same grain would then be used a second time, giving a lighter everyday ale for ordinary meals. And finally, that same grain, now nearly spent, would be used a third time, producing what people called small ale, or small beer, thin, mildly bitter, and so low in strength that a modern drinker would barely notice it was alcoholic at all. This was the version poured for children for breakfast and for anyone doing hard physical work who needed something in their cup all day without losing their balance or their good sense by noon. I want to correct something small but important here because it trips people up constantly, myself included at first. Ale and beer were not simply 2 different names for the same drink. Ale was the older tradition made from grain water and yeast alone, sometimes flavoured with herbs like heather or a bitter little plant called yarrow. Beer as a separate idea arrived from across the sea, brewed the same way, but with hops added into the mix, a plant that gave the drink a sharper, more bitter edge, and helped it keep longer without spoiling. Hopped beer reached English shores from the Low Countries sometime around the year 1400, and it took more than a century after that before English farmers began growing hops of their own in any real quantity, and older folk, as older folk tend to do, were not thrilled about it. Plenty of them grumbled that this hopped beer was a nasty foreign import, an insult to good honest English ale, the sort of complaint that sounds almost funny once you realise people have been suspicious of new drinks and new food for about as long as drinks and food have existed at all. The government of the day cared enough about all of this to write it into law. An old regulation called the Assize of Bread and Ale had already been controlling the price strength and quality of ale for centuries before the Tudors ever took the throne, and by the middle of the 1500s, printed guides were still being published to help local officials enforce it properly. Towns appointed their own ale tasters, ordinary citizens given the very specific job of sampling a brewer's latest batch and deciding whether it was fit to sell at the price being charged. According to one old story about these tasters that keeps getting repeated in local histories, at least a few of them checked a batch by pouring a little of it onto a wooden bench and sitting down in it wearing leather trousers waiting to see whether the bench felt sticky when they stood back up. Too much leftover sugar meant the brew had not finished fermenting properly. I cannot promise you every ale taster in England did this, but I love that somebody somewhere thought it up. Ale was not only an everyday necessity either. It carried its own small ceremonies. Around the turning of the new year, some communities would gather around a great bowl of warm spiced ale, passing it hand to hand, while singing out wishes for good health and a fruitful harvest, a custom known as wassailing. In some orchard villages, people even carried spiced ale out to the apple trees themselves, pouring a little at the roots and hanging soaked bread in the branches, half in celebration and half in genuine hope that the trees might hear them and produce a heavier crop that year. A drink that filled ordinary cups every single morning was on the right night of the year treated as something worth singing to. Most of that brewing, especially away from the grandest households, was done by women. A wife or a mother would brew for her own family as a normal part of running a home, the same way she might bake bread or salt meat for winter. And a woman skilled at it could earn a real income selling her extra ale to neighbours, sometimes hanging a green bush outside her door as a sign that a fresh batch was ready. You may have come across a popular claim online that the pointed hat we associate with witches today grew out of these women called alewives needing to be seen clearly across a crowded market. It is a fun image, and I understand exactly why it spread so easily. But when historians actually go looking for solid evidence behind that particular claim, they mostly come up empty-handed. What we do know for certain is simpler and honestly just as interesting. Brewing began as skilled, respected domestic work largely run by women, and it only shifted toward being a male-dominated, heavily regulated business once it became clear there was real money sitting inside every barrel. As ale-making grew from a household task into a proper trade with guilds licenses and larger breweries entering the picture, the women who had quietly kept this whole industry running for generations were little by little pushed toward the edges of it. It is a pattern you will notice again and again once you start looking for it in history. Work stays humble and mostly female right up until somebody realizes it is worth serious money. Even inside the grandest houses in the land, this drink was never treated as an afterthought. When Elizabeth of York, Queen Consort to the first Tudor king, wrote across the sea to the Spanish court about her son's future bride, she included a small practical warning among the formal courtesies. The water in England, she explained, was not something a newcomer should rely on, and the young princess would do well to grow used to wine before she ever set sail. It is such a small detail tucked into a letter about a royal marriage, and yet it tells you everything about how ordinary and how necessary this whole habit of avoiding plain water truly was, from the poorest cottage all the way up to the palace itself. Historians who've gone through old household accounts have found that an ordinary labourer might get through somewhere around a gallon of ale across a single working day spread out over breakfast, the midday meal and supper, with skilled workers in some records drinking even more than that. Milk, meanwhile, barely factored into an adult's daily drink at all. Cows only produced it seasonally, and whatever milk a household did have was usually too valuable to simply drink, since it needed to become butter or cheese to last through the winter months ahead. What milk was consumed fresh tended to go to children, and usually only earlier in the day, so picture it for a moment. An entire population, men and women, the elderly, and yes, children too, moving through an ordinary day, mildly, gently sustained by a low-strength homemade brew, believing all along that they were simply keeping their bodies warm and balanced while quietly avoiding a genuine danger they could not see and would not have understood even if you sat down and explained it to them directly. They were right for almost entirely the wrong reasons, which might be one of the most human things I've come across in all of this research. There is something almost funny about it looking back from where we stand now. We exist inside a world that studies water constantly, that argues over which bottle is purest, which filter is best, whether 8 glasses a day is a real rule or something we all just quietly agreed to believe. And here is a whole society that mostly stepped around plain water entirely not out of confusion, but out of centuries of hard-earned, if imperfectly explained, experience. They were not being reckless. They were working with the best understanding available to them, and it happened to keep them a little safer than it had any real right to. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment. So much of what looks strange from where we stand now was simply somebody centuries ago paying careful attention to their own world and responding to it as sensibly as they knew how. Not foolish, not primitive, just working with a different set of tools than we have and doing it on the whole remarkably well. I'm curious about something, actually. Somewhere in your own family there is probably a small habit passed down, without much explanation, the kind of thing your grandmother did a certain way and never quite told you why. If one comes to mind while you're listening tonight, I would love to hear about it down in the comments. I have a feeling more of those old habits have real reasons behind them than any of us usually stop to consider. But drinking was only the first small ritual of that morning, settled almost without thought before a single chore had even begun. Once that cup was set down, a very different question was waiting for her, and this one had nothing to do with what went into her body at all. It had everything to do with what covered it, and just how a person in that world managed to feel clean, presentable and decent in a house with no running water, no soap, as we would recognize it today, and certainly no hot bath waiting behind a door down the hall. The basin came out before anything else that morning, a shallow bowl of water already sitting near the hearth, warmed just enough to take the worst of the chill off it. A folded strip of linen sat beside it, along with a small dish holding something pale and gritty that most of us today would not recognize as anything you would willingly put in your mouth. And with that simple little collection of objects, an ordinary Tudor person considered themselves properly washed for the day. No tub, no standing pool of water deep enough to climb into, just a basin, a cloth, and roughly 10 quiet minutes, given over to the face, the hands, and the feet. If that sounds like the bare minimum to you, I understand completely, because it did to me too the first time I looked into it seriously. We tend to picture Tudor England as a filthy place full of people who simply never bathed and did not much care. But once you dig past that assumption, a far more interesting explanation shows up. This was not laziness. It was a whole medical worldview, one that honestly believed climbing into a tub of hot water could put your life in danger. Across Europe at the time, a fear had taken hold that heat and standing water could soften the skin and open it up almost like loosening a door that was meant to stay shut. And once that door stood open, sickness, bad air, and every unseen danger floating through a Tudor town were thought to have a much easier path straight into the body. A hot bath was not a luxury in this framework. It was much like leaving every window in your house unlocked during plague season. That said, I do not want to leave you with the wrong impression here, because a full bath was not some forbidden act nobody ever attempted. A physician might actually prescribe one for a particular illness, believing the right combination of warm water and herbs could restore a patient's balance rather than upset it. Brides sometimes bathed before a wedding as part of the preparation, and travellers arriving at a grand house after a long muddy journey were occasionally offered a proper wash before dinner as a mark of hospitality rather than daily habit. So a bath was not unthinkable. It was simply treated as an occasional deliberate event planned around a specific reason, rather than something you did every morning without a second thought, so instead of soaking, people scrubbed. The face, hands and feet took the daily attention, since these were the parts of the body most exposed to dirt, sweat, and the world in general, while the rest of the body was left mostly alone, trusted to a different method of staying clean altogether, one that had almost nothing to do with water. Here is the part I find so clever once you understand it properly. Underneath their outer clothing, nearly everyone in Tudor England wore a plain linen shift, or shirt worn directly against the skin day after day. That piece of linen did an enormous amount of quiet work. It absorbed sweat-caught body oils and pulled dirt away from the skin itself, almost the way a modern athletic shirt is designed to wick moisture, except this fabric was doing it with nothing but plain woven flax and centuries of trial and error behind it. And because that shift touched bare skin all day, changing it regularly became in a very real sense the actual bath. A wealthy household might change linen shirts and shifts daily, sometimes even more than once, while a poorer family stretched the same piece of linen across several days out of simple necessity, then scrubbed it thoroughly on washing day to start the cycle fresh. The logic ran the opposite way from ours. We wash the body and treat the fabric on top of it as an afterthought. They trusted the fabric to do the washing and left the body itself mostly untouched by water. The gap between rich and poor showed up here more clearly than almost anywhere else in daily life. A wealthy gentlewoman might own a dozen linen shifts or more folded away in a chest, rotated so that a fresh one always sat ready against her skin. A labouring family, by contrast, might own 2 or 3 shirts between an entire household, mended and remended long past the point a modern person would have thrown them out. Looking clean in Tudor England had far less to do with how often you bathed and far more to do with how much linen your family could afford to own in the first place. Can I ask you something? Honestly? When you picture yourself living through an entire winter with no full bath, only a basin and a change of linen, does some small part of you feel a flicker of relief? That you were not born 500 years earlier, I will admit mine does most days. And then some other small part of me wonders whether we have simply traded one set of rituals for another and will look just as strange to somebody 500 years from now. Washing day itself, when it did come around, was no small task. Linens were not simply dunked and wrung out. They were soaked in a mixture of water and wood ash, sometimes left to sit overnight in a process people called bucking, which worked as a rough homemade version of bleach and soap combined. The lye pulled dirt and staining out of the fibres in a way plain water never could on its own. Afterward, the linen was rinsed again and again, then spread out flat across grass or low bushes in the sunlight, since sunlight itself was believed quite correctly, as it turns out, to help whiten and freshen the fabric. An entire hillside outside a Tudor town dotted white with drying linen on a clear morning must have looked almost like a field of resting swans from a distance. This work fell almost entirely to women, and it was punishing. Wet linen is heavy, lye is harsh on the hands, and a large household's washing could take an entire day or more to finish properly. But it also carried its own quiet social value. Washing day often became a shared task among women. In a village, a chance to talk to trade news and to keep an eye on each other's households, all while their hands stayed busy with something truly useful. A great deal of village gossip, I suspect, was traded over a tub of lye water, long before anyone thought to write any of it down. There was one more washing ritual, though, that had nothing to do with washing day at all, and it happened at nearly every single meal in nearly every household, rich or poor. Before anyone sat down to eat, a basin and a jug of water were brought around the table, and each person washed their hands in full view of everyone else. This was not simply about avoiding a greasy grip on shared food, though that mattered too, since most meals still relied on fingers rather than forks for a great deal of the eating. It carried a social weight as well as small daily proof that you respected the people you were about to share a table with enough to appear before them clean. Etiquette books from the period spent real space on the subject, instructing readers exactly how and when to wash, and warning against the coarse habit of picking at your teeth or your ears with bare fingers once the meal had begun. A clean pair of hands offered openly at the start of dinner said something about your character that no amount of fine clothing could quite substitute for. Teeth received their own peculiar routine, since toothpaste as we understand it simply did not exist. People rubbed their teeth clean with a rough cloth, sometimes dipped in a little salt, sometimes in soot scraped carefully from the inside of a cooking pot. It sounds almost unbelievable now, but plain soot worked gently across the teeth does actually help scrub surface staining away, even if a modern dentist would still have a great deal to say about the practice. Wealthier households could afford small silver toothpicks worn on a chain, alongside other little grooming tools, a detail that always makes me smile, because it means personal hygiene even then doubled as a quiet way of showing off. And once the body was as clean as the routine allowed, the air around it still needed some attention. Fresh rushes and sweet-smelling herbs, rosemary, lavender, and sometimes dried meadowsweet, were scattered across floors to mask ordinary household smells and to make a room feel cared for. Wealthier men and women often carried a pomander, a small perforated case sometimes made of silver or gold, packed with fragrant spices and dried petals. Part fashion accessory, part portable air freshener and part protection. Since many people believed a strong sweet scent could actually help hold off the bad air thought to carry disease, if a Tudor lady lifted a small golden ball to her nose while passing through a crowded street, she was not simply being delicate. She truly believed that scent was doing some real medical work, standing quietly between her and whatever unseen danger the air around her might be carrying that day. Now, I have to tell you about one particular story because it comes up constantly whenever this topic gets discussed online, and it deserves a proper look. You have almost certainly heard the claim that Elizabeth I once said she bathed only once a month, whether she needed it or not. It gets repeated in books, documentaries, and countless articles as though it were an established fact straight from her own mouth. Here is the strange truth. Nobody has ever managed to trace that exact quote back to Elizabeth herself, or to anyone who actually knew her. The earliest known appearance of that line seems to surface centuries after her death, in a much later gossip column of all places, with no clear source behind it at all. What we do know from records that survive from her own household paints a rather different picture. Elizabeth had a private bath built specifically for her own use, and attendants recorded washing and dressing her with real regularity, very possibly every single day in some form, even if a full immersion bath happened less often than that. She was, by most contemporary accounts, unusually attentive to her own appearance and cleanliness, for someone of her era not carelessly dirty in the way that popular quote likes to suggest. It is a small reminder that even a famous line repeated in 100 books can still turn out to be built on very little solid ground. There was one more figure inside the royal household whose entire job revolved around cleanliness of a very particular kind, and I think his story says something fascinating about how power actually worked back then. He held the formal title of Groom of the Stool, and his official responsibility was tending to the king's most private bodily needs, supplying water towels and a basin whenever they were required. It sounds like the least desirable position anyone could hold at court. In practice, it became one of the most fought over, because whoever held that position spent hours alone with the king, every single day in moments no council meeting or formal audience could ever offer. He heard unguarded complaints, private worries, and honest opinions that never once reached the ears of ambassadors or nobles waiting outside a grand chamber door. Several men who held this title went on to manage the king's personal finances, carry his official seal and shape decisions that altered the course of the entire country. One of them stood beside Henry VIII's very deathbed. In a court obsessed with status, the nearest access anyone ever achieved to the king came through the most humble, unglamorous task imaginable. Power, it turns out, rarely announces itself through the grand gestures we tend to expect. More often it slips in quietly, through whoever happens to be standing nearest when nobody important is watching. I think about that quite often, honestly, whenever I catch myself assuming that influence always looks impressive from the outside. Sometimes the person with the real power in a room is not the one giving the speech. Sometimes it is the person nobody else even bothered to notice was there. Tell me something while we are on the subject of clean and unclean. If you had to guess, would you say we actually wash more carefully today than a well-kept Tudor household did? Or simply more often using tools that make the job faster, without necessarily making us any more thorough about it? I have my own suspicion, and it might surprise you which way I lean. We spend our days surrounded by soap in a dozen cents hot water at the turn of a single handle, and entire aisles built around getting us clean in ways no Tudor household could have imagined. And yet stand any of us next to a well-run Tudor home on washing day linens boiling in lye floors, freshly strewn with rosemary faces and hands scrubbed every morning without fail, and I am not entirely sure we would come out looking more disciplined about it than they were. We simply solved the same basic problem with different tools working from a completely different map of how the human body actually functions. And somehow most days they still ended up presentable enough to stand in front of a king. That more than anything might be the real lesson tucked inside all of this. Clean is not one fixed idea that every century agrees on. It shifts quietly, according to whatever a particular time and place happens to believe about the body and about the invisible dangers surrounding it. What looks sensible and careful to a Tudor household looks strange to us now, mostly because we are working from a completely different set of facts about the world, not because they cared any less about the impression they made. And once she had finished at that basin, dried her hands on the linen cloth, and tucked away that little dish by the hearth, there was still one enormous decision waiting for her, before she could ever step outside her own front door. Because in her world, what she put on her body after washing said almost as much about her as her own name did. It could tell a stranger exactly how much money her family had, exactly where she stood in the world, and in some towns it could even get her fined if she dared to wear the wrong colour thread on the wrong day of the week. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it is a far bigger claim than it sounds like at first. We're not talking about fashion trends, the sort of thing where wearing last year's style just makes you a little unfashionable. We're talking about actual written law, passed by actual parliament spelling out in careful detail exactly which fabrics, which furs, and which colours a person was legally permitted to put on their own back, based entirely on how much money they had or which family they had been born into. These were called the sumptuary laws, and the Tudors did not invent them, but they certainly took them further than almost anyone before them. Only the royal family itself could wear true purple or cloth woven through with real gold thread. Step down one rung, and dukes and marquises were allowed a little gold cloth of their own, provided it did not cost more than £5 for a single square yard, an almost comical level of bureaucratic precision for something as simple as what a person chose to wear that morning. Earls and everyone above them could wear sable fur. Barons and everyone above them could wear cloth of silver or satin. A gentleman of more ordinary standing might be permitted velvet in his doublet, but only in certain places on the garment, while a common labourer was left, with plain wool, undyed linen, and whatever sheepskin his family could spare. And so it continued, rank after rank, colour after colour, fabric after fabric, all the way down to the poorest household in the land, whose choices were narrowed until almost nothing remained but plain wool and undyed linen. Even within that narrow allowance, poorer families rarely bought new cloth at all. A good wool coat was expected to outlive the person who first owned it, passed down, taken in, let out again, as children grew and patched so many times that the original fabric sometimes made up less than half of what remained. Nothing about that was seen as shameful. It was simply how clothing worked when every single yard of cloth had to be spun, woven, and dyed entirely by hand before it ever reached a single needle. A garment that lasted 3 generations was not a sign of poverty so much as a sign of careful, sensible households, doing exactly what sensible households have always done with anything expensive and difficult to replace. Here is the detail that still catches me off guard every time I think about it. That deep purple reserved only for royalty was not simply rare because a law said so. It was rare because of what it actually cost to make. The dye came from crushing thousands of tiny sea snails drop by careful drop in a process so labour-intensive and so expensive that a single small piece of purple cloth could truly be worth more than its own weight in gold. The law was not creating scarcity out of nothing. It was taking something that was already almost impossibly rare and making absolutely certain that rarity stayed locked behind the palace gates. And black of all things tells an even stranger story. If you pictured Tudor black as the plain modest choice the colour a humble person might wear to avoid drawing attention to themselves, I completely understand why. That is more or less how black works in our own closets today. But achieving a deep, even truly rich black in the 16th century required imported dyes and a difficult, expensive process that most dyers struggled to get exactly right. A poorly dyed black faded fast, turning a dull, uneven brown within a season. A properly expertly dyed black held its depth for years, which meant that a truly convincing black outfit was in its own quiet way just as loud a statement of wealth as anything dripping in gold thread. Henry VIII understood this perfectly well, and chose black again and again in his own portraits, not because he wanted to look humble, but because he wanted anyone looking at that painting centuries later to know exactly how much that particular shade of nothing had cost him. His daughter Elizabeth took the whole idea of clothing as a display of power to a scale that still sounds unreal when you hear the actual numbers. Records kept by her own household describe a wardrobe holding somewhere around 260 separate gowns, alongside nearly 100 robes and well over 100 cloaks, before you even begin counting petticoat sleeves and the hundreds of smaller accessories stored alongside them. Meanwhile, an ordinary working family in the same kingdom at the very same moment in history might own 2 or 3 shirts between every member of the household mended and remended for years, past the point a modern person would ever consider wearable. Both of them were following the exact same set of laws about clothing. The law simply left one of them an almost limitless wardrobe, and the other one barely enough to stay decent. Can I ask you something? Think about your own closet for a moment. Is there a colour or a fabric sitting in there right now that you associate with looking put together or successful or expensive, even if you could not fully explain why if pressed? I would put real money on the answer being yes. We like to think we've moved past letting cloth decide how seriously people take us. I am not entirely convinced we have. Now women occupied a strange and slightly overlooked corner of all this legislation, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Much of the formal written law around sumptuary rules was aimed squarely at men spelling out exactly what a knight, a gentleman, or a merchant could and could not wear according to his rank. Women were mentioned far less often in the actual statutes themselves. That did not mean a woman's clothing carried no consequences. Her choices still reflected on her husband or her father, and still marked her place in society just as clearly as any man's doublet did. But it did mean that in certain corners of fashion, particularly around headwear and accessories, women found just a little more room to maneuver than the letter of the law technically allowed the men standing beside them. You can actually watch this play out inside a single royal marriage, which I find one of the more human details buried in all of this legal language. When Catherine of Aragon arrived in England, she brought with her a particular style of headdress, a stiff gabled shape that framed the face in a distinct triangular line, and for years it became the standard for fashionable English women to imitate. When Anne Boleyn later rose to prominence at court, she favoured a different style entirely. A French hood, softer, rounder, worn further back from the face, a design she'd grown used to during years spent at the French court as a young woman. The choice was not simply about which shape looked more flattering. Court ladies watching closely understood exactly what message a particular hood was sending about, where a woman's loyalties and influences lay long before she ever opened her mouth to say a single word. Cloth and shape were doing political work that a modern audience might expect only speeches and treaties to handle. Clothing marked more than rank and loyalty, though. It marked exactly whose household you belonged to in a manner almost nobody today has any real equivalent for. A wealthy lord's servants, from the cook down to the stable boy, were dressed in matching colours and badges tied to that particular family, a practice known as livery. Walk through a Tudor town on a market day, and you could tell at a glance which great house a particular servant answered to, purely from the colours sewn across his shoulders. It functioned almost like a uniform crossed with a family crest announcing not who that person was as an individual, but whose protection, whose reputation and whose name they carried with them into every room they entered. We still do a quieter version of this ourselves if you think about it for a moment. A stranger in a particular sports jersey, a particular company polo shirt, or even a particular shade of green tied to one coffee chain over another, tells you something instantly before a single word gets exchanged. We simply stopped calling it livery and started calling it branding, without ever really letting go of the underlying idea that cloth and colour can announce exactly which group a person belongs to long before their name ever comes up. There is one more thread in this story, and it belongs almost entirely to a single woman most people have never heard of. Her name was Dingen van der Plasse, and she arrived in London from Flanders in the year 1564, one of many skilled refugees who crossed the sea during a period of serious religious upheaval on the continent. She brought with her a particular skill, the art of starching linen, something almost nobody in England had any real expertise in at that time. She opened her own business teaching this technique to English households, and within a remarkably short span of years that one imported skill quietly transformed English fashion. Starch allowed linen to be shaped pleated and held upright in ways that had simply been impossible before, and it is the entire reason the enormous, elaborate ruffs we now associate with this era were even possible in the first place. Some of the largest examples used hundreds of individual pleats and stretched wider than a person's own shoulders, held rigid with hidden wires and heated irons, all thanks to one immigrant woman's particular expertise. That expertise came with its own quiet controversy too, which I find strangely satisfying to know. The best starch was made from fine wheat flour, and during years when harvests ran short there was real public tension over grain that could have gone into bread instead being used to stiffen the collars of the wealthy. Somewhere in a poor Tudor household, a mother was rationing flour for the week's loaves, while somewhere across town a noblewoman's servant was stirring an entire pot of that same precious flour into paste for a single collar. Fashion, it turns out, has always had a way of quietly competing with far more basic needs for the very same resources. The government tried again and again to keep some kind of grip on all of this. Elizabeth herself issued more than one proclamation, specifically targeting the size of ruffs, worried that fashion was drifting entirely out of proportion to a person's actual rank, at one point reportedly stationing officers at the city gates with orders to cut down any collar judged to have grown too extravagant for its owner's station. It rarely worked for long. Fashion, much like water, tends to find its way around almost anything built to contain it. There was even a particular law passed in the year 1571 that had nothing to do with silk or velvet at all. It required almost every ordinary man and boy over the age of 6 to wear a plain wool cap on Sundays, and official holidays purely to prop up struggling English wool sails, with a fine attached for anyone caught without one. Picture that for a moment. An actual act of parliament, debated and passed by grown men in positions of serious national authority, dedicated entirely to what was sitting on top of an ordinary boy's head on a Sunday morning. It stayed on the books for roughly 26 years before finally being quietly repealed, and here is the part that always makes me laugh a little every single time I come back to it. For all this careful legislation, stacks of it, decade after decade, rewritten and reissued again and again by monarch after monarch, historians who have studied the actual court records generally agree that enforcement was patchy at best. Local officials were technically empowered to stop a person on the street and question the fabric on their back, and a shopkeeper could in theory be fined simply for selling silk to a customer with no legal right to wear it. Wealthy merchants routinely wore silks and furs technically reserved for the nobility above them, and largely got away with it, because prosecuting every ambitious cloth merchant in London would have been an endless, thankless task nobody in government particularly wanted. The laws stayed on the books because they were useful for making point. They were only occasionally enforced because actually policing an entire nation's wardrobe, it turns out, was never quite as simple as writing the rule down in the first place. I think that tells you something honestly quite comforting about human nature. Across every single century we have ever lived through, rules about appearance get written with enormous confidence. People given even the smallest gap to work with tend to find their way around them anyway. A merchant's wife in a gown slightly too fine for her official station was not committing some shocking act of rebellion. She was doing exactly what people have always done with rules they consider a little unfair, which is quietly, politely and consistently push right up against the edge of them. So the next time you get dressed for something that matters to you, a job interview, a first date, a gathering where you want to be taken seriously, I want you to remember that woman standing in her small Tudor home, choosing between the 2 or 3 outfits legally available to someone of her station, knowing full well that a stranger could take in her entire social standing at a glance before she ever said a single word. We like to imagine we have left all of that behind us, but stand in front of your own closet one of these mornings and tell me honestly that you never once choose an outfit because of exactly what you want it to say about you before you have spoken at all. Once she was finally dressed properly, covered properly marked by every colour and fabric law allowed her, there was still the small matter of actually getting through the rest of her day. And the very next thing waiting for her had nothing to do with cloth or colour or status at all. It had everything to do with what was about to appear on the table in front of her, because in her world even a single meal came wrapped in almost as many unspoken rules as the clothes she had just finished putting on. It had everything to do with what was about to appear on the table in front of her, because in her world even a single meal came wrapped in almost as many unspoken rules as the clothes she'd just finished putting on. The first surprise, if you were somehow dropped into her kitchen that morning, would probably be the clock itself, or rather the complete absence of anything resembling our modern one. There was no real breakfast waiting for her, not in the way we understand the word today. A little bread, perhaps, or whatever was left from the night before, eaten quickly and without much ceremony. The proper meal of her day, the one that actually counted, would not arrive until somewhere around 11 in the morning, a substantial dinner that functioned as the true centre of the entire household schedule. Supper followed much later, somewhere around 5 or 6 in the evening, lighter, quieter, often the last real food anyone touched before the long stretch of night we spent time with earlier in this very story. 2 solid meals spaced out across daylight hours, with almost nothing formal in between, and on a good number of those days whatever landed on her plate had already been decided for her, long before she ever sat down, not by her own appetite but by the calendar hanging somewhere in the back of her mind. A wealthier household might sit down to that same dinner with a servant standing quietly nearby, ready to carve, pour and refill the moment a cup ran low, while a poorer family gathered around a single pot set directly on the table, everyone reaching in with their own spoon. Same 2 meals a day, roughly the same hours, and an entire world of difference sitting between them. I want to walk you through something here that truly surprised me the first time I understood it properly, because it upends a story most people, myself included at one point, simply assume without ever checking. We tend to picture fasting days, the old custom of eating fish instead of meat on certain days of the week, as a purely religious holdover from the Catholic world England had just broken away from. Fridays without meat, the long stretch of Lent, a church calendar dictating what filled your bowl. That much is true enough, and it had been true for centuries before the Tudors ever took the throne. Before the Reformation reached England, something near 1/3 of the entire year had counted as a fasting day of one kind or another. Fridays the whole of Lent and a scattering of other holy days besides all of it, built around penance rather than politics. But here is the part that rarely gets told properly. When Henry VIII broke with Rome and built his own church, fasting on fish days briefly became suspect, almost a little too Catholic for comfort, and the old habit truly started slipping in places. And that slip caused a real measurable problem, one that had nothing to do with theology at all. Fewer fish days meant fewer people buying fish. Fewer people buying fish meant fishing boats sitting idle in harbour, and idle fishing boats meant fewer trained sailors, fewer working ships and a weaker maritime nation, at exactly the moment a small island kingdom needed every trained sailor and seaworthy vessel it could possibly hold on to. So the government stepped back in, and this time religion had almost nothing to do with it. Under young King Edward VI, fish days were formally reinstated by secular law, with the reasoning spelled out in language about as blunt as government documents ever get, explaining plainly that the point was worldly and civil policy, sparing meat and favouring fish for the good of the wider community, where so many fishermen and sailors depended on that trade for their entire living. By the time Elizabeth's government took hold of the idea, her chief advisor, William Cecil, pushed it even further, adding an extra fish day onto every single week on top of the older religious ones, a policy people at court half-jokingly started calling political Lent. Wednesday became a fish day, too purely to keep England's fishing fleet busy, its harbours active and its supply of experienced sailors ready for whatever the sea might eventually demand of them. And a few short decades later, when a certain enormous Spanish fleet came sailing up the English coast, that same pool of trained seasoned sailors and working ships played no small part in how that story ended. Can you imagine that for a moment an entire population changing what sat on their dinner plate multiple days a week, not because a priest told them to, but because their own government had quietly decided the health of the nation's navy depended on it? Somewhere in a small kitchen, a mother preparing herring instead of mutton on a random Wednesday evening had absolutely no idea she was in her own small way helping keep a fleet of ships stocked with sailors who might one day need to defend the entire coastline. History rarely announces itself through the front door. Most of the time it slips in quietly through something as ordinary as what ends up on your fork. Now, dinner itself, at least for anyone with real money, was never simply about being fed. It was theatre stage 3 times a day for anyone important enough to be watching. And nowhere does that show up more clearly than in the strange, almost playful habit wealthy Tudor households had of disguising one dish as something else entirely. A cook might thread raisins, prunes, and dried apricots along a length of string coat, the whole thing carefully in a rich sauce, and present it at the table looking remarkably like the internal organs of a freshly hunted deer, purely for the shock and delight of watching a guest's face when they realized what they were actually eating. Roasted peacock on the grandest tables might be carefully skinned before cooking, then just as carefully redressed afterward in its own feathers once it came off the fire propped upright, so it appeared to be sitting there fully alive, tail fanned out feathers gleaming right in the middle of the feast. Food, at this level of society, was never only about taste. It was a performance, a small piece of theatre designed to leave a room full of guests talking about your table for months afterward. A truly grand feast might set out dozens of separate dishes across a single course, far more than any one guest could possibly taste, in an evening arranged less for practical eating and more for the sheer visual weight of abundance itself. Nobody expected you to sample everything laid out in front of you. The point was simply to see it all sitting there at once, a small mountain of roasted meats, pies and elaborate sauces, proof that your host could afford to waste food on a scale most of the kingdom would never see in an entire year. Where you actually sat at that table mattered just as much as what landed on it, and this is where another small piece of everyday language quietly traces its roots straight back to this world. In a great hall, the lord of the house and his most honoured guests often sat at a raised table set slightly above the rest of the room, facing outward toward everyone else near the warmth of the fire and the best of the light. A great household usually owned one large, often beautifully crafted container of salt, expensive and slow to produce, and it sat somewhere near the middle or the head of that same long dining table, marking exactly where the honoured end of the room stopped and the ordinary end began. Everyone of lesser standing distant relations, minor guests, household officers sat farther down, the same table on the other side of that same salt cellar. If you have ever heard someone described as sitting above the salt or below it, meaning respected or overlooked, that phrase is not some abstract metaphor invented by a novelist. It describes an actual physical container sitting on an actual table, quietly sorting an entire room of guests into who mattered and who did not, without anyone needing to say a single word about it out loud. There is a small etiquette detail from this same world that I find oddly charming. Surviving instruction manuals from the period written specifically to teach young people proper table behaviour spell out rules that sound almost comically specific today. Cut your bread with a knife rather than tearing it apart with your bare hands. Never leave your spoon sitting inside a shared serving dish once you are finished with it. And whatever you do, never dip a piece of meat directly into the shared salt cellar, a habit apparently common enough among careless diners that someone felt the need to write it down as an official rule. Good manners, it turns out, have always required someone somewhere to spell out the extremely obvious for the benefit of everyone who kept getting it wrong. Here is a word I think you will enjoy, because I certainly did once I traced it back properly. We use the word banquet today to describe basically any large, impressive meal, a wedding banquet, a corporate banquet, anything grand and plentiful. In Tudor England, that word meant something far more specific and far stranger than we would ever guess from how casually we use it now. A banquet was not the main meal at all. It was an entirely separate course of sweets, served afterward often in an entirely different building altogether. Wealthy households built small ornamental structures out in the garden, sometimes perched on a rooftop purely for this one purpose, tucked away with a view of a pond or a distant hillside, called quite plainly a banqueting house. Once the main meal in the great hall had finally finished, and the heavy trestle tables were cleared away, the most honoured guests would rise, step outside, and walk across the garden to this separate little building, where an entirely new spread of sugarwork, marzipan, spiced wine, and candied fruit was waiting for them. And the sugarwork itself could be extraordinary. Skilled confectioners moulded marzipan and sugar paste into castles, animals, coats of arms, entire miniature scenes, built purely to be admired and occasionally eaten, though a truly impressive piece was often considered too beautiful to actually cut into. When Elizabeth I visited one of her noblemen at his country estate in the year 1591, the household reportedly presented her with roughly 1,000 separate sweet dishes during her stay, including sculpted sugarwork modelled after her own royal coat of arms, alongside sugar castles and fantastical animals built purely to honour her visit. 1,000 dishes built almost entirely out of sugar, sitting inside a garden building constructed for no other purpose than showing off exactly how much a household could afford to spend impressing a single guest. Sugarwork like this was not only for grand royal visits either. Every new year, courtiers hoping to catch the Queen's favour competed quietly against one another through elaborate food gifts, ornate marchpane sculptures, boxes of candied fruit dressed up as beautifully as any jewel, and personalised pies crafted specifically with her in mind. A well-made gift of sugar could say things a courtier might never dare say directly to a monarch's face, offering flattery, ambition, and careful political positioning all wrapped up inside something sweet enough to eat. Can I ask you something? Honestly, have you ever gone slightly overboard preparing for a guest you really wanted to impress, cooking 3 desserts when one would have done the job perfectly well? I have a feeling that particular instinct, the urge to slightly overdo hospitality for someone whose opinion matters to you, has not changed nearly as much across 5 centuries as we might like to think. We simply traded sugar sculptures for elaborately plated dinner parties and carefully staged dessert tables. The actual mechanics of eating, meanwhile, looked almost nothing like our own. Forks were essentially unheard of at an English Tudor table. People ate with their fingers, a knife and a spoon, each guest typically expected to bring or use their own personal knife, rather than rely on the household to provide one. It sounds unrefined to modern ears perhaps, but etiquette around exactly how you use those fingers, which ones touch the food, How you reached across a table and how quickly you wiped your hand clean carried real social weight of its own. Eating with your hands was not a lapse in manners. It was simply the manners of the age governed by rules just as particular in their own way as any set of instructions involving a fork and 3 different spoons might be to us now. I think what strikes me most looking back across all of this is how much effort an entire society poured into a meal that modern life often treats as something to squeeze in between 2 more important tasks. A Tudor dinner was not simply fuel. It was a stage for wealth, a tool of foreign policy hidden inside a plate of herring, a small architectural project built purely to hold sugar sculptures for one afternoon. Food told a story about who you were, who you served, and what you valued long before the first bite was ever taken. I wonder sometimes what a stranger 500 years from now might make of our own tables, if they somehow found a record of them. Would they notice how carefully we photograph a meal before we ever taste it, arranging the plate, just so waiting for the right light? Would they understand why a certain restaurant, a certain cake, a certain bottle of wine carries so much unspoken weight at a celebration meant to matter? I suspect they would recognize exactly what we were doing, even if every single detail looked completely foreign to them. Some instincts, it turns out, never really go out of fashion. We simply keep finding new ingredients to dress them in. But all that sugar spooned generously into cup after cup worked into marzipan castle, after marzipan castle, night after night, year after year, was quietly leaving its own mark on the very people enjoying it most. It gathered in places no household account book ever bothered to record, no tailor ever measured, and no portrait painter ever fully captured, at least not on purpose. And that mark was not hidden away in some account book or garden folly. It showed up somewhere far harder to disguise than a redressed peacock ever could. It showed up right in the middle of their smile, in a habit so strange and so strangely fashionable that the wealthiest people in England eventually began to fake it on purpose. Let me tell you what a German visitor named Paul Hentzner actually wrote down after meeting the Queen herself, somewhere near the end of her reign, because I think it says more in a few words than most descriptions manage in a full page. He described her face as narrow and pale, her eyes small but sharp, and then almost in passing he mentioned her teeth had turned black, a condition he said the English seemed especially prone to on account of how much sugar they ate. Sit with that for a moment. A foreign visitor standing in front of the most powerful woman in England walked away, most struck not by her crown or her gown, or the enormous weight of her authority, but by the colour of her teeth. And here is where the story gets truly strange in a way that still catches me off guard every time I sit with it. Sugar back then was not the cheap endless substance sitting in every kitchen cupboard today. It arrived from far away, passed through several hands before it ever reached English shores, and cost enough that only wealthy households could afford to use it, regularly stirred into wine, worked into marzipan, dusted over meat, sweetened into the sort of elaborate banqueting spreads we spent time with earlier in this very story. Poorer families barely touched the stuff, which meant in a twist that still makes me smile that rotten teeth were not a mark of poverty in Tudor England. They were nearer to the opposite. A mouthful of decay quietly announced that you could afford a great deal of something most of the country could not. There is a small, oddly human detail buried inside this story that I think deserves a moment of its own. Elizabeth was by most accounts truly terrified of anyone coming near her mouth with a tool. When one particular tooth finally became too painful to ignore, she reportedly refused treatment for so long that one of her own bishops felt he had to prove the procedure was bearable by having a healthy tooth of his own pulled first right in front of her, purely to demonstrate that the pain would not be unbearable. Even the most powerful woman in England, it turns out, could still be talked into medical treatment only through the same gentle, slightly theatrical persuasion any anxious patient might need today. She also tried in her own way to care for her teeth, rubbing a paste of honey and sugar across them with a rough cloth, an approach that sounds almost painfully counterproductive to modern ears, treating the very source of the damage as though it might somehow also be the cure. You have probably come across the claim somewhere online that ordinary people who could not afford sugar began deliberately blackening their own healthy teeth with soot purely to look wealthier than they actually were. It is a wonderful story, and I want to be honest with you about it rather than simply repeating it because it sounds good. The actual surviving evidence for that particular detail is thinner than most retellings let on. What we can say with real confidence is that sugar consumption among the wealthy did visibly damage teeth, that foreign visitors specifically remarked on it as an English trait tied to wealth, and that the Queen herself, by most contemporary accounts, suffered real and painful decay by the time she reached her later years. Whether ordinary villagers truly ran around blackening perfectly good teeth to keep up appearances is a livelier story than the evidence fully supports. Sometimes the truth is a little quieter than the legend built around it, and I would rather hand you the quieter version than the exciting one that cannot fully hold its own weight. Can I ask you something? Think about the last time you saw someone with an obviously expensive habit on display, an item, an experience, particular kind of exhaustion that only comes from a very specific costly lifestyle. We're still doing some version of this ourselves, reading small physical signals off each other and quietly translating them into assumptions about money and status, usually without even noticing we are doing it. By her later years, several of Elizabeth's teeth had fallen out entirely, and foreign ambassadors reportedly found her speech honestly difficult to follow because of it. Rather than allowing that particular problem to reach the public eye, attendants are said to have quietly packed small bits of cloth inside her cheeks before important appearances, filling out the hollows well enough to preserve the shape of her face for a portrait or an audience. It is a small, almost tender image once you sit with it. A queen who ruled an entire nation still needing someone near her working quietly and privately, just to help her face hold its shape for the room. Teeth were only the beginning of what a Tudor face could tell you about its owner, though, and the Queen herself became the walking, breathing example of the next part of this story. In the year 1562, Elizabeth caught smallpox, a disease that came dangerously near to ending her reign before it had properly begun. She survived, but the illness left her skin scarred in places, and for a woman whose entire public identity rested on being seen painted and admired, that was not a small problem to manage. Her answer came in the form of a cosmetic called Venetian ceruse, sometimes known by the rather poetic name Spirits of Saturn, a thick white paste made from vinegar mixed with finely ground white, led a soft and quietly poisonous metal. Applied carefully across the face and neck, it smoothed over. Scarring brightened the complexion and gave the skin an almost porcelain quality that Tudor beauty standards prized above almost anything else. And there was a second layer of logic sitting quietly underneath all that whiteness, one worth pausing on. A pale, untouched complexion was not simply considered pretty for its own sake. It was proof that you had never needed to labour outdoors under an open sky, the way a farmhand, a fisherman, or a servant most certainly did every single day. Pale skin, much like a mouthful of sugar rot, was really just wealth, quietly written across the body for anyone paying attention to notice. The forehead came under just as much scrutiny as the skin covering it. Fashionable women of the era often plucked their hairline further back and thinned their eyebrows down to the barest suggestion of a line chasing a tall, smooth, oval-shaped forehead, that portraits of the time clearly prized above almost any other single feature. Looking at those paintings now, that towering hairless expanse of forehead can look almost unsettling to modern eyes, nearer to a stylized mask than an actual human face. But to Tudor eyes trained on an entirely different standard, it passed as elegant, composed, and unmistakably refined. The trouble, of course, was that metal itself. We now understand its exposure causes serious lasting harm, hair loss, skin damage, and a slow accumulation of poisoning the longer it sits against the skin. Elizabeth and her ladies had no such understanding. Some accounts suggest she left layers of this paste in place for extended stretches at a time, adding fresh coats over the old, rather than removing it daily, allowing that metal far more contact with her skin than any modern dermatologist would ever tolerate. When the makeup finally did come off, the cleansing mixture used to strip it away sometimes included its own mercury-based ingredients, which hardly improved matters. Her lips and cheeks, meanwhile, often relied on a vivid red pigment called cinnabar, striking and beautiful in candlelight, and also built from a compound containing mercury. None of this stayed confined to the Queen alone either. Whatever Elizabeth wore on her face quickly became the standard. Every ambitious court lady felt pressure to match, since standing beside your monarch looking noticeably less pale, less polished, or less carefully composed was never a wise career move for anyone hoping to keep her favour. An entire generation of aristocratic women quite literally painted a slow, invisible poison onto their skin, morning after morning, not out of ignorance exactly, but out of a completely reasonable desire to belong at the very centre of power, where belonging had a very specific, very demanding look attached to it. I want to be careful here because this is a place where popular retellings tend to run further than the actual historical record comfortably supports. You will find no shortage of articles confidently declaring that this particular makeup killed the Queen outright. The truth, as far as serious historians can tell, is considerably murkier than that. Elizabeth lived to nearly 70 years old, a remarkably long life by the standards of her century, and she suffered from a range of health complaints across her final years that could easily be explained by ordinary aging grief and the accumulated toll of a demanding decades-long reign. Exposure to that poisonous metal through her cosmetics almost certainly did her no favours, and probably contributed to some of the symptoms recorded around her, but reducing her entire decline to a single toxic cosmetic flattens a far more complicated, far more human story into something nearer to a cautionary tale than a genuine biography. There is a particularly cruel little cycle hiding inside all of this once you sit with it long enough. The very substance meant to smooth and protect the skin was quietly damaging that same skin, with every application drying it out, irritating it, sometimes leaving it rougher or more uneven than before, which meant the next layer had to be thicker than the last just to cover what the previous layer had already begun to ruin. It is not hard to imagine a woman standing in front of her mirror watching her own reflection slowly change underneath the substance she trusted completely, reaching for more of the exact thing quietly responsible for the problem in the first place, simply because nothing else in her world offered a faster fix. Here is what I keep coming back to, though, the longer I sit with both of these habits side by side. A blackened smile and a bone-white face were on the surface working toward completely opposite goals. One openly displayed decay, the other desperately tried to erase every visible flaw. But underneath both of them sat the exact same quiet message, repeated in two entirely different languages. Look at me closely enough, and you will see proof that I never had to struggle for anything in my life. Even the damage on my own body has been curated carefully to prove exactly how much I could afford to lose. We still do this honestly if you look closely enough at what counts as fashionable in any given decade. Think about how certain kinds of exhaustion get treated as glamorous, how deliberately faded, worn, or expensively imperfect certain trends are marketed to look, how a specific kind of pale, untouched skin still gets treated as a marker of leisure in some corners of the world, while an equally specific kind of sun-kissed skin gets marketed the exact same way somewhere else. The particular symbol changes from century to century and sometimes from country to country. The underlying instinct using the body itself as a small, quiet billboard for exactly how comfortable your life has been seems remarkably resistant to going out of style. Can I ask you something else before we move on? If a Tudor lady could somehow see the lengths people go to today, the injections, the procedures, the treatments that carry their own quiet risks, all in pursuit of a very specific, very fashionable version of a face, do you think she would find any of it foreign at all? Or do you think she would simply nod, recognize the shape of the exact same instinct wearing slightly newer clothes, and ask us what we were using to whiten our own teeth these days? There is something almost tender in a strange way about imagining that Queen, each morning sitting perfectly still, while someone carefully layered poison across her face, sometimes finishing the whole routine with a thin glaze of egg, white brushed over the top meant to seal the paste in place, and leave the skin looking smooth and faintly glossy under candlelight. She believed the whole time that she was simply protecting her image, her authority, her place at the very top of an entire kingdom. She was not being foolish. She was working quite seriously with the best beauty knowledge her century had to offer, inside a culture that had convinced an enormous number of people that visible suffering worn correctly could somehow pass as strength. I think about the sheer patience that morning ritual must have demanded both from her and from whichever attendant stood beside her, brush in hand, layering something they had no real way of knowing was slowly working against them. There was no warning label on that little jar. There was no cautionary rumour passed quietly between ladies at court, no whisper that this particular shade of perfection might be costing them more than it appeared to give. There was only the mirror, and the belief that whatever it reflected back was worth whatever it eventually took. That belief, more than any single ingredient sitting inside that little jar, is probably the most dangerous thing in this entire story, and the one detail that has never once gone out of fashion. And when that same suffering eventually caught up with her, when headaches, fatigue, or a troubling rash appeared, and someone finally needed to be called in to treat her, the person walking through that chamber door carried an entirely different map of the human body than the one actually responsible for what she was feeling. He would not think in terms of poisonous metals or mercury or any poison hiding quietly beneath her skin. He would not once suspect the very paste sitting in a small pot on her own dressing table. He would think instead about balance, about temperament, about the invisible forces his entire profession still firmly believed governed every single symptom the human body could ever produce, and about which particular substance drawn quietly from her own body might finally set that balance right again. Before I tell you what that substance was, I want to slow down for a moment and actually build the whole system underneath it, because I think it deserves more credit than it usually gets. We tend to hear about bloodletting and immediately picture something reckless, almost cartoonish, a handful of confused men in robes making things worse out of pure ignorance. That picture is not fair, and honestly it is not even accurate. What Tudor physicians were working with was a complete, carefully reasoned model of the human body, built up over more than 1,000 years of careful observation, passed down from ancient physicians whose work was still being taught word for word inside English universities. At the centre of that model sat 4 fluids believed to move through every human body in constantly shifting amounts. blood warm and moist tied to the season of spring and to a cheerful, energetic temperament. Yellow bile warm and dry tied to summer and to a quick, fiery temper. Black bile cold and dry tied to autumn and to a quieter, more thoughtful, sometimes melancholy nature. And phlegm cold and moist tied to winter and to a calm, steady disposition. A healthy person in this model was simply someone whose four humours sat in careful balance with one another. Illness, on the other hand, meant one of those fluids had grown too abundant, crowding out the others, and needed to be gently coaxed back into proportion. A physician did not treat every patient the same way either, because no two people were thought to share the exact same natural balance to begin with. A hot-tempered, quick-to-anger patient judged to run naturally high in yellow bile might be advised toward cooling foods, cucumber lettuce and mild wine gently steering their whole constitution back toward calm. A patient judged naturally sluggish and overly phlegmatic, by contrast, might be pushed toward warming spices and more vigorous exercise, waking their system back up. Diet, in other words, was not simply about hunger. It was considered active medicine, prescribed as carefully and as personally as anything a modern doctor might write on a chart today. Once you understand that framework bloodletting stops looking like nonsense and starts looking like something nearer to a logical conclusion drawn from a perfectly reasonable premise. If illness meant too much blood had built up inside the body, then removing a controlled amount of that blood was not an act of cruelty. It was a precise medical correction, aimed carefully at the exact problem the physician believed he was looking at. They were not guessing wildly. They were applying a full, internally consistent theory, as carefully as they knew how, the same way any doctor today applies whatever the best current model of the body happens to be. Bloodletting was not only reserved for the visibly sick either, which surprised me the first time I came across it. Plenty of healthy people scheduled a bleeding purely as maintenance, often timed around each solstice and equinox, treating it almost the way we might treat a seasonal checkup or a regular dental cleaning today, a small preventive ritual meant to keep the whole system running smoothly before anything actually went wrong. Diagnosis, meanwhile, rarely began with a conversation about symptoms the way it might today. It began with a small glass flask. Physicians placed enormous weight on examining a patient's urine, studying its colour thickness and clarity against a printed chart sometimes called a urine wheel, which matched dozens of subtle shades against a whole catalogue of possible imbalances. A physician might hold that flask up to the window light, swirl it gently, and occasionally, by some accounts, even taste a drop of it, chasing the faintest hint of sweetness that might point toward an illness we would now recognize instantly as diabetes, centuries before anyone had a name for it, or any understanding of why it mattered. The physician, though, almost never picked up the blade himself. Educated at a university trained in Latin texts and ancient theory, a physician considered the actual cutting of skin beneath his professional station entirely. That work fell to someone else, a tradesman standing at the very particular crossroads of two skills that sound almost absurd side by side to modern ears. The barber. Can you imagine walking in for a haircut and leaving with a small, carefully measured bowl of your own blood instead? That was quite literally a normal Tuesday for a Tudor barber. The same steady hand trusted to shave a customer's face safely was considered perfectly qualified to open a vein, and the same small shop handled both services without anyone finding it strange in the slightest. In the year 1540, England formally organised this trade under a royal charter, creating the Barber Surgeons' Company and drawing an official legal line between simple barbers and the more skilled barber surgeons permitted to handle blades wounds and the occasional tooth extraction. Henry VIII himself took a personal interest in the whole arrangement, commissioning the court painter Hans Holbein to create a large, formal portrait marking the occasion, the king seated at the centre charter in hand, surrounded by the very physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries who tended to his own health. That painting still survives today, hanging in the hall of the Guild. It was created to celebrate a quiet reminder that this entire branch of medicine once mattered enough to earn a king's personal attention and a master painter's careful brush. And this is where one of my favourite pieces of hidden history shows up sitting in plain sight on ordinary streets even now. That red and white striped pole you still see spinning outside barbershops today did not start out as a random decoration. The white represented the bandages used to bind the arm afterward. The red represented the blood itself. And the pole underneath both colours represented something even more specific. The actual wooden staff a patient was handed to, gripped tightly during the procedure, since squeezing something firmly helped the veins stand out more clearly under the barber's blade. You are looking every single time you pass one of those spinning poles at a small advertisement for a medical procedure most of us would find truly alarming today, quietly disguised now as nothing more than a barbershop decoration. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. How many small everyday symbols do you think are still floating around us right now, stripped of whatever serious meaning they once carried, simply because enough time has passed that nobody bothers asking where they actually came from anymore? Now deciding exactly when to perform this bloodletting was never left to guesswork either, and this next part is where astrology quietly walks into the middle of Tudor medicine, fully welcomed, not lurking around the edges as some sort of embarrassing superstition. Physicians trained at English universities studied astrology as a serious required part of their medical education, right alongside anatomy and Latin texts. Almanacs printed each year included a particular diagram known as the zodiac man, a simple drawing of a human body with each section assigned to a different sign of the zodiac, starting with the head at Aries and working down to the feet at Pisces. That chart was not decoration either. It was a genuine practical scheduling tool. If the moon currently sat in Gemini, a sign associated with the arms, a careful physician would avoid bleeding a patient's arm that particular day, waiting instead for a safer alignment. If the moon moved into Taurus, tied to the neck and throat treatment anywhere near that region got postponed as well. Surgery medicine dosing, and by some accounts, even something as small as trimming a person's toenails could be timed around this same chart. I have to be honest, that last detail always makes me laugh a little. Somewhere in Tudor England, a person truly checked the position of the moon before reaching for a pair of nail clippers, and did so with complete sincerity, the same careful sincerity we might bring to checking a weather forecast before planning a picnic. Getting access to any of this care, though, depended enormously on how much money you actually had, in a pattern that should sound familiar by now if you have been with me through this whole story. A university-trained physician charged fees far beyond what an ordinary family could ever consider, paying reserved almost entirely for the wealthy and the powerful. Barber surgeons, cheaper and far more common, handled the practical work of bleeding, pulling teeth and stitching wounds for a much wider slice of the population, and beneath both of them sat the apothecary, someone trained to prepare and sell herbal remedies and simple medicines, the nearest thing Tudor England had to a modern pharmacist. Even apothecaries, though, remained fairly rare. By the year 1600, only around 100 of them were operating across the entire country, meaning most ordinary families relied on home remedies, church almanacs, and whatever a local wise woman or herbalist happened to know, long before any trained professional ever entered the picture. Nearly every cottage garden, no matter how modest, kept a small patch set aside purely for medicine rather than food. Sage fever, few rue, and chamomile, growing quietly beside the vegetables tended by whoever in the household had inherited the knowledge of which leaf worked, for which complaint. That knowledge rarely appeared in any book. It passed from a mother to a daughter, from one neighbour to another, refined slowly across generations, through nothing more scientific than careful, repeated observation of what actually seemed to help. There was one more piece of logic sitting underneath Tudor medicine that I find quietly beautiful once you actually understand what it was trying to do. Physicians and herbalists of the period believed that plants carried visible clues deliberately placed by their maker, pointing toward exactly what each plant was meant to heal. A walnut split open to reveal something resembling the folds of a human brain was thought to treat headaches and disorders of the mind. A spotted lung-shaped leaf called lungwort was reached for specifically to treat coughs and chest complaints. A small flower with a dark centre resembling a tiny pupil, fittingly named eyebright, was steeped and used to bathe tired or infected eyes. This idea even had a proper name, the doctrine of signatures, and while it sounds almost like poetry to modern ears, it reflects something we still do ourselves constantly without ever quite noticing. We look for patterns in the world around us, and we trust those patterns to tell us something true long before we have any real proof one way or the other, and every so often, purely by accident, that instinct actually led somewhere useful. Willow bark chewed for centuries by ordinary people to ease pain and reduce fever turned out many years later to contain the exact same active compound, eventually refined into modern aspirin. Nobody in a Tudor herb garden understood salicylic acid or receptors or inflammation pathways. They simply noticed generation after generation that a particular bitter bark seemed to help, and they kept reaching for it entirely on the strength of careful observation repeated often enough to be trusted. I think that is honestly the most important thing to take away from all of this. It is easy to look back at bloodletting astrology charts and walnut-shaped brain medicine and feel a comfortable little rush of superiority, congratulating ourselves on how much smarter we have become since then. But every single piece of this system was built the exact same way modern medicine is built now, through careful observation, inherited knowledge, and an honest attempt to explain suffering using the best tools available at the time. They were not fools stumbling around in the dark. They were remarkably serious, remarkably organized people working from a map of the human body that later turned out to be wrong in its details, while still getting the underlying instinct that the body could be understood, studied and cared for with real method exactly right. Can I ask you something? Honestly, how many of your own health habits could you actually explain properly if a stranger asked you to justify them from first principles, rather than simply saying you picked it up somewhere, or everyone seems to do it? I have a feeling most of us are carrying around at least one belief that would sound just as strange to a future audience as a zodiac chart sounds to us now, and we would defend it with exactly the same confidence a Tudor physician once defended his. Which makes me wonder honestly what we're doing right now with complete confidence that someone 500 years from now will look back on with the exact same mixture of fascination and disbelief we bring to a barber holding a blade over someone's arm. I suspect the list is longer than any of us would like to admit, and that thought alone might be the most useful thing any history of medicine can teach us. There was something else those four humours were believed to shape beyond simple physical health, something that mattered just as much to an ordinary Tudor family as any fever or ache ever could. A person's particular balance of blood, bile and phlegm was thought to shape their entire temperament, whether they ran hot-tempered or calm, quick-witted or steady, passionate or reserved. Physicians of the period even believed men and women carried a naturally different balance from birth. Men generally judged warmer and drier by nature. women generally judged cooler and moister, an idea that shaped far more than medical textbooks alone. It shaped what people expected from each other at home, at court, and eventually at the altar. And when it came time for a family to choose exactly who their son or daughter should marry, temperament sat right alongside land, money, and family name on the very short list of things that actually mattered. A hot-tempered man was often thought to need a calmer wife to balance him, and a family weighing a potential match sometimes considered a young woman's disposition every bit as carefully as they considered the size of her dowry, treating marriage itself as one more careful attempt to bring two unpredictable humours into some kind of lasting livable balance. Before we go any further, I want to clear up something that gets repeated so often online. It has practically become accepted fact, even though it really is not. You have probably heard at some point that people in this period married impossibly young children, marrying children entire lives decided before anyone involved had finished growing up. It makes for a striking headline. It is also, for the overwhelming majority of actual Tudor people, simply not what happened. Historians who have gone through parish registers in real detail keep landing on roughly the same numbers. An ordinary woman in Elizabethan England typically married somewhere in her mid-20s. An ordinary man usually married a little later, still nearer to his late 20s. And the reason had nothing to do with romance or readiness in the way we might think about it today. It came down to simple, unglamorous economics. A new household needed a house to settle into, tools to work with, and enough saved coin to actually survive the first difficult year together. Most young people spent their late teens and early 20s working as servants or apprentices in someone else's household, quietly saving toward exactly that goal, and only married once they had truly earned their independence. So where does the myth actually come from if it is not describing most people's real lives? It comes from the handful of families wealthy enough and important enough that their marriages got written down, painted and remembered in detail for centuries afterward. Church law did technically allow betrothal at a young age for children of the nobility and gentry, almost always for reasons of property inheritance and dynastic alliance, rather than anything resembling ordinary courtship, and even then actual life together as husband and wife was typically delayed for years, afterward, sometimes explicitly postponed by the very parents who arranged the match in the first place. Those particular unions survive in the historical record precisely because the families involved were rich and powerful enough for scribes, portrait painters, and later historians to bother writing about them at all. An ordinary farmer's daughter marrying at 26 left no such trail, which means the loudest stories are not always the most representative ones, a lesson that applies to quite a bit more than just Tudor marriage. It is worth adding, too, that contemporary writers of the period were not blind to age gaps either. Couples with a wide noticeable difference in years between them could face real mockery and gossip from their own neighbours, since most people of the time truly expected a husband and wife to be reasonably near in age, similar in temperament, and matched in more than simply money and land. The image of an entire society calmly accepting any pairing at any age, purely because a contract said so, does not hold up well once you actually look at what ordinary people were saying about each other at the time. Can I ask you something? How often do you think we make the exact same mistake today? Assuming the most famous, most talked about version of something must also be the most typical one, simply because it is the version that actually reached us. For families with real property or position to protect a marriage was never treated as a private matter between two young people falling in love. It was a formal, carefully staged negotiation nearer in spirit to a business merger than anything we would recognize as a proposal today. The process generally unfolded across three distinct stages. First, The two families reached an agreement in principle that a match made sense, weighing land connections and reputation with the same seriousness a modern company might bring to evaluating a partnership. Second came the truly difficult part, hammering out the financial details, exactly what the bride's family would provide as a dowry and exactly what the groom's family would guarantee her in return should she ever be widowed, a protection known as her jointure. These negotiations could stretch on for weeks, and surviving contracts from the period get remarkably specific, listing exact sums of money, parcels of land, household linens, livestock, and sometimes even particular pieces of furniture, all written down and agreed upon with the same seriousness a modern family might bring to negotiating a mortgage. Love, whatever role it eventually played, was rarely the first item on that particular list. Only once both sides had agreed on every last term did the couple themselves formally commit to one another. Long before any of those formal negotiations began, though ordinary courtship still had its own quiet language built around small, carefully chosen gifts rather than grand declarations. A young man hoping to catch a particular woman's attention might offer her a pair of gloves, a ribbon, or a simple ring engraved with a short verse, or a pair of linked hands, a design people at the time called a true love knot. None of these gifts carried any legal weight on their own, but accepting one and wearing it where others could see sent a message every neighbour in the village understood perfectly well, long before any family sat down to discuss land or dowries at all. Affection. It turns out still found small, quiet ways to announce itself even inside a system so heavily weighted toward practical calculation. That commitment had a name of its own, one that has almost entirely vanished from everyday English now, though I think it deserves to be remembered. It was called hand fasting, and it involved exactly what it sounds like: the couple physically joining hands in front of witnesses to seal their promise. In canon law at the time, this was not treated as some casual symbolic gesture either. A properly witnessed hand fasting could carry real legal weight of its own functioning, almost like a binding pre-contract, which is precisely why the next step in a Tudor wedding mattered so much. Disputes over exactly this kind of promise kept church courts remarkably busy throughout the period. If a man hand-fasted to one woman, turned around and tried to marry someone else entirely, the first woman had real legal standing to challenge that second marriage before an ecclesiastical judge, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, depending on how convincingly she could prove the earlier promise had actually taken place. A hand clasped in front of 2 or 3 witnesses decades before either party ever saw the inside of a courtroom could still determine who a person was legally allowed to marry. Words and handshakes carried a kind of weight back then that we rarely extend to anything less than a signed document today. Before any couple could marry inside a church, their intentions had to be formally announced out loud on 3 separate Sundays to the entire parish, a practice called crying the banns. This was not empty ceremony. It gave the whole community an actual window to raise an objection, and the single most common objection on record was that one partner had already been hand-fasted to somebody else entirely. Marriage, in other words, ran on a kind of small-town legal transparency that would feel almost unthinkable to most of us now. Your entire romantic history essentially open for public comment, 3 Sundays running before you were allowed to proceed. If no objection ever came, the wedding itself unfolded right at the church door before moving inside for the full ceremony, the couple kneeling together before the altar, a veil draped gently over both their heads, while the priest spoke the blessing over them. Only once that veil was lifted again was the marriage considered complete in the eyes of the church and community alike. Not everyone, of course, was willing to sit quietly through this entire careful, deliberate process, and some of the more daring stories from this period truly delight me. Henry VIII's own niece, Lady Margaret Douglas secretly married a nobleman named Lord Thomas Howard without royal permission, a decision serious enough that both of them were sent to the Tower of London once the king found out since a marriage that near to the throne carried real political weight, whether the young couple intended that or not. Around the same time, Mary Boleyn's sister to the king's second wife quietly married a soldier named William Stafford, a man with far less money and status than her family expected, and was cast out of court in disgrace for choosing him anyway. Whatever else you want to say about the rigid contract-driven nature of Tudor marriage, it clearly was not powerful enough to stop every single person from occasionally choosing love, or at least stubborn preference, over careful family strategy. I find something quietly reassuring in that, honestly. An entire legal and social machine built specifically to keep marriage tidy, predictable and controlled still could not fully account for two people simply deciding they wanted each other more than they wanted their family's approval. Have you ever made a decision you knew would disappoint people whose opinion mattered to you purely because the alternative felt unbearable? I suspect Mary Boleyn understood that feeling rather well. Once a couple actually reached their wedding day, one particular custom took root that we're all still quietly following, most of us, without ever asking why. The ring was placed specifically on the fourth finger of the left hand, and the reasoning behind that choice was entirely medical, or at least entirely medical according to the science of the time. Physicians and scholars of the period believed a particular vein ran directly from that exact finger straight to the heart, a delicate thread they called the vein of love. Placing a ring there was not simply decorative. It was meant to connect that promise as literally as possible to the very organ believed to hold a person's deepest feelings. We now know that particular vein does not actually exist in the way they imagined it, and yet here we are all these centuries later, still sliding rings onto that exact same finger, following the shape of a belief that outlived the science it was originally built on entirely. Somewhere along the way, the anatomy quietly fell apart under more careful study, and the gesture simply kept going anyway, because by then it no longer needed the science to feel true. There is a wonderful little word hiding inside the wedding celebrations themselves too, one you have almost certainly used without ever tracing it back. Once the church ceremony finished, ordinary communities threw a celebration. The whole village pitched in for food, dancing, and a great deal of specially brewed ale sold that day specifically to help the new couple start their life together with a little extra coin in their pocket. That particular wedding ale had a name of its own, bride ale, and if you say that phrase quickly enough a few times, you will hear exactly where our modern word bridal actually came from. Every single time you hear someone mention a bridal shower or a bridal party, they are unknowingly referencing a barrel of homemade ale sold at a village wedding 5 centuries ago. I think what moves me most about all of this, honestly, is how much genuine tenderness manages to survive inside a system built almost entirely around contracts, negotiations, and careful financial protection. A jointure clause protecting a young widow was not romantic in the slightest, and yet it represented real practical care for a woman's future safety in a world offering her very few other guarantees. That protection mattered more than it might sound too in a world where remarriage was simply a normal expected part of adult life. Illness and childbirth carried real constant risk, and a surprising number of Tudor marriages were in fact someone's second or even third. A widow who had inherited a solid jointure from her first husband often found herself somewhat unexpectedly one of the more independent and desirable figures in her entire community, holding property and income in her own name at a moment when very few other women could say the same. Losing a husband was never something anyone wished for, but surviving one with the right paperwork behind her could occasionally leave a woman with more genuine freedom than she had ever held before. A community publicly celebrating a new household with borrowed ale and shared food was not required by any law at all, and yet villages did it anyway again and again because watching two people build a life together seemed to matter to people. Then in almost exactly the way it still matters to us now, marriage in the end asked a Tudor family to hold two very different things at once. Cold calculation about land and money sitting right beside a genuine hope that the two people involved might actually come to care for each other, given enough time and a fair amount of luck. Most days I suspect that is not so very different from what any of us are quietly hoping for ourselves, no matter how we happen to dress the process up for our own century. We have traded dowries for dating profiles and jointure clauses for prenuptial agreements, and somehow still end up hoping for the exact same fragile, unreasonable thing underneath all of it, that the contract and the affection might against the odds turn out to be pointing in the same direction, which might be the oldest hope in this entire story. But a wedding day, no matter how carefully negotiated, no matter how joyfully celebrated with bride ale and dancing long into the night, was really only the opening chapter of what an entire village quietly expected to follow it. Because once those two people finally settled into their new household together, there was one particular room, one particular event that every single person watching that celebration already understood was waiting somewhere further down the road. A room far quieter than any wedding feast, and considerably more dangerous than anything we have spoken about so far in this whole story. A few weeks before her baby was due, a Tudor woman did something that sounds almost dramatic when you say it plainly. She disappeared. Not literally, of course, but in every practical sense that mattered to the outside world. This was called taking her chamber, and it meant withdrawing into a single carefully prepared room, sometimes for a full month before the birth, and several weeks after it cut off almost entirely from ordinary daily life until the whole process was finished. Before she ever crossed that threshold, a short church service was often held in her honour, the community asking God's blessing over her, and the child still waiting to arrive, a quiet send-off before the door closed behind her for what might be weeks. The preparation for that room could be remarkably specific, and we actually know exactly how specific, because a document survives describing it in detail. Henry VII's own mother, Margaret Beaufort, sat down at some point in the 1480s and wrote out precise instructions for how a royal lying in chamber ought to be arranged, instructions that shaped English royal births for generations afterward. The walls and ceiling were to be hung entirely in blue fabric. Only one window was left uncovered so the mother could choose exactly how much daylight she wanted to let in. The floor was carpeted unusual for the period, and a grand ceremonial bed stood against one wall purely for show, while the actual birth itself typically happened somewhere far less decorative, often on a plain pallet, or seated upright on a specially built birthing stool. Notice who was never mentioned anywhere in those instructions. No husband, no male physician, no priest beyond a single blessing offered before the woman withdrew. For the entire length of her confinement, that room belonged completely to women, one of the very few spaces in Tudor society where men were simply not permitted to set foot, regardless of their rank, their wealth, or how much they wanted to be there. Inside that chamber gathered the midwife and a small group of the mother's nearest friends, women, who would sit with her through the entire ordeal, offering encouragement, practical help and company through whatever came next. There is a word for exactly this group of women, one you use constantly today, without ever suspecting where it came from. They were called her gossips, from an old term meaning god relation, since these were typically the very same dear friends who would later stand as godparents to the child once it arrived safely. Over time, as rooms full of women gathered again and again for this exact purpose, talking through the long hours of labour, sharing news and comforting one another. The word slowly drifted away from anything to do with godparents at all, and settled instead into the meaning we use now, women simply talking together. The next time somebody rolls their eyes at gossip as something trivial or petty, I think it is worth remembering that the word was born inside one of the most serious, most female-controlled rooms an entire society ever had. The midwife herself carried real authority in that space built entirely on experience, rather than any university training, since no woman was permitted anywhere near a university in this period at all. She'd usually spent years learning her craft the only way it could be learned, then standing beside older, more experienced midwives at birth after birth, absorbing knowledge no book of the period bothered to record. She knew how to judge whether a birthing stool or a simple pallet suited a particular labour better, how to ease a child gently into a better position if it had settled the wrong way, and how to recognise often well before anyone else in the room when a birth was turning dangerous and needed every ounce of skill she carried. By the middle of the Tudor era, the Church had taken on the job of formally licensing midwives, which meant swearing a detailed oath before a bishop's official, and that oath tells you a remarkable amount about what worried Tudor society most. A midwife had to promise she would never keep the umbilical cord or afterbirth for herself, since both were rumoured to be useful in witchcraft, and rumour alone was dangerous enough to require an official promise against it. She had to swear never to swap one woman's baby for another, and never to falsely claim paternity on a father's behalf, since her private knowledge of exactly whose child had just arrived carried real social and legal weight in a small community. And in one striking exception to nearly every rule about women and religious authority in this period, a midwife was permitted to baptize a baby herself immediately, without waiting for a priest if that child seemed unlikely to survive. It was the only sacrament a woman was ever officially allowed to perform in the entire Church of England, granted specifically because a dying infant could not wait for permission to arrive from anyone else. That single exception meant a midwife often kept a small vial of water within easy reach throughout every single birth she attended, just in case ready to act in seconds rather than sending someone running for a priest who might arrive too late to matter. It is a small practical detail, and yet it tells you everything about how seriously this entire community treated the fragile handful of hours right after a child's first breath, when so much still hung in the balance. Can I ask you something? Doesn't it say quite a lot about a society, the one exception it is willing to make to its own strictest rules, and exactly which moment of desperation finally earns that exception? Officially, that same oath forbade midwives from using charm spells or any prayer beyond what the Church had approved. Unofficially, plenty of women reach for exactly that kind of help, anyway, quietly in a room no priest was ever allowed to inspect too closely. A particular polished stone called an eagle stone might be tied against a labouring woman's thigh, believed to ease and speed the birth along, passed carefully from one household to another, sometimes borrowed specifically for this single purpose, and returned again once the child had safely arrived. A small silver rattle fitted with a piece of coral might already be waiting nearby, not simply as a toy but as a charm believed to help protect a newborn from sickness in its earliest, most fragile days. Official doctrine and quiet practical superstition sat right next to each other in that room, the same way they so often did throughout this entire story, and nobody standing inside that chamber seemed particularly bothered by the contradiction. Can I ask you something else while we are on the subject? When you think about who surrounds a woman during childbirth today, a partner, a doctor, perhaps a doula, machines quietly monitoring every heartbeat in the room, does it strike you as strange or oddly comforting that a Tudor woman had something we have almost entirely lost, an entire room of women who had personally survived the exact same ordeal she was walking into, sitting right there beside her the whole time. I want to tell you about one particular birth now because I think it captures both the hope and the real danger sitting inside every single one of these rooms more honestly than any general description ever could. In the autumn of the year 1537, Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, went into labour at Hampton Court Palace, after years of the entire kingdom waiting for exactly this moment, a healthy son to finally secure the Tudor line. Her labour stretched on for the better part of 3 exhausting days. On the 12th of October, a boy was born, the future King Edward VI, and church bells rang out across London in celebration that the king finally had his long-awaited heir. Bonfires were lit in the streets that same night, and messengers rode out across the country, carrying the news to every corner of the kingdom. A father who had waited nearly 3 decades for exactly this moment, finally allowed to celebrate without reservation. For a few days afterward, everything seemed to be going remarkably well. Jane felt strong enough to sit up in bed and receive guests following her son's christening, propped up carefully among pillows, smiling as courtiers filed past to offer their congratulations, appearing by every account we have to be recovering exactly as anyone would have hoped. And then within days her condition suddenly turned. She grew feverish, drifted in and out of consciousness, and died on the 24th of October. Not from the birth itself, but very likely from an infection that took hold in the days immediately following it. The same quiet, invisible danger that claimed so many women of this period, regardless of their wealth, their status, or the very best care an entire kingdom could offer them. I tell you that story not to leave you with something heavy to carry into the rest of tonight, but because I think it deserves to be told honestly, without softening it into something smaller than it was. Even with royal physicians, royal comfort, and the full resources of the English crown standing behind her, Jane Seymour still could not be protected from a threat medicine at the time had no real way of seeing, let alone stopping. That single fact tells you more about the real quiet courage every Tudor mother carried into that chamber than almost anything else I could describe to you. Most births, thankfully, ended nothing like Jane's. Far more often that same lying in chamber filled with laughter instead of fear, gossips passing a newborn carefully from one set of arms to the next, someone already sent running to fetch spiced warm ale to toast the mother's strength, the whole household breathing out in relief together. For every story, history chose to remember, because tragedy made it memorable. Countless quieter ones simply ended in exhaustion. Joy and a healthy cry filling that small blue-draped room exactly the way everyone had been hoping for all along. If a woman did survive both the birth and the vulnerable weeks that followed, one final ceremony marked her return to ordinary life, and it happened roughly a month after the child arrived. It was called churching, a formal service of thanksgiving held at the church where the mother dressed carefully and often veiled in white was met at the door by the priest and led back inside to offer thanks for having survived. Her gossips usually walked beside her for the occasion, turning what could have been a solemn errand into something nearer to a celebration among old friends. For her husband, that same stretch of weeks had its own private nickname, among Tudor households sometimes called his gander month, a small, half-joking acknowledgement that he'd been left rather helplessly to manage the house alone, while the far more serious work happened entirely without him. I have to imagine a great many Tudor husbands spent that particular month discovering exactly how much their wives quietly managed on any given ordinary day, fumbling through meals, servants, and household accounts they had never once needed to think about before, and probably developing a fresh appreciation for her the moment that chamber door finally opened again, There is something I find quietly powerful about all of this once you step back and look at the whole shape of it together. For one entire month in nearly every Tudor household, authority simply changed hands. The most important room in the house belonged completely to women, run by women, protected by women's knowledge, closed firmly against the very men who otherwise held power over nearly every other part of that same household. It was dangerous, certainly more dangerous than almost anything else an ordinary woman would face across her entire life. But inside those blue-draped walls for a few private weeks, she was also the absolute centre of her own small, fiercely guarded world. I think that is worth sitting with, honestly. In a society that gave women so little formal authority, almost everywhere else, one room, one specific stretch of weeks, belonged to them, completely, expertise and all. A husband with land title and a seat on the parish council still could not so much as cross that threshold without permission. For once, the knowledge that mattered most in the entire house was knowledge only women were trusted to hold, and once that chamber's shutters finally opened again, once the windows that had been sealed so tightly against every draught of cold air were thrown wide to let the ordinary world back in, an entirely different kind of danger was waiting just outside them. Because closed windows, blocked keyholes, and carefully guarded air were never only about protecting a mother in childbed, they were about a fear that ran through nearly every corner of Tudor life, in every household, in every season, a quiet, constant worry about exactly what might be riding on the breeze, outside waiting for the smallest crack to slip through, whether a person happened to be lying in or simply going about an entirely ordinary day. The thinking behind that fear deserves a proper explanation, because once you understand it, an enormous amount of strange Tudor behaviour suddenly starts making a great deal more sense. Nobody in the 16th century had any concept of a virus, a bacterium or a flea-carrying disease from one body to another. What they had instead was a theory built on centuries of careful observation, one that noticed correctly that sickness tended to cluster around foul-smelling places, stagnant water, crowded streets, and unburied waste. From that honest observation they drew a reasonable, if ultimately mistaken, conclusion. If bad smells and disease kept turning up together, then surely the smell itself, the corrupted air rising from rot and filth, was the thing actually spreading the sickness. They called this bad air miasma, and it shaped nearly every decision Tudor England made about public health for the entire century. Think about the places a Tudor physician would have warned you away from, and the logic starts to line up with real experience rather quickly. Open sewage ditches running through crowded lanes, the thick, heavy air hanging over a crowded churchyard in high summer, when the ground itself seemed to breathe something unpleasant back at you. A poorly drained marsh outside town where a strange heavy mist tended to settle each evening, just as fevers seemed to rise among the people living nearest it. None of these observations were foolish. They were simply missing one final piece of the puzzle, the invisible creature actually doing the damage rather than the smell surrounding it. Here is the part I find quietly remarkable, though. Even working from a theory we now know was not quite right, Tudor authorities still built something startlingly near to a modern public health response, purely by following that flawed logic as carefully and consistently as they knew how. In the year 1578, Elizabeth's government issued what historians now consider England's first proper national plan for managing an epidemic, a set of instructions known simply as the Plague Orders. Reading them now feels almost eerie because the shape of the response looks so familiar. Infected households were shut up inside their own homes for a full 40 days, unable to leave under any circumstances, with a watchman posted outside around the clock to make sure nobody slipped out early. The door of that house was painted with a red cross, and beneath it the words, "Lord have mercy upon us," a plain public marker warning every neighbour and passer-by exactly what lay behind that particular threshold. The orders went further than simple confinement too. Wealthier parishioners were taxed specifically to help cover food and basic supplies for families locked inside their own homes, since a household unable to work for 40 straight days still needed to eat, and leaving them to starve would have driven desperate people to break quarantine regardless of any watchman standing outside their door. Can I ask you something? Honestly? Does any of that sound completely unfamiliar to you, or does some part of it land a little nearer to home than you expected, given everything the whole world quietly lived through together, not all that long ago? The parallel runs deeper than watchmen and red crosses too, and not always in a flattering direction. Whenever plague settled over London in real force, those with money and land elsewhere simply left retreating to country estates, far from the crowded, dangerous streets, sometimes for months at a stretch, while poorer families tied to their trade, their rented rooms and their daily wages had no such option available to them at all. Even Elizabeth's own court packed up and relocated during the worst outbreaks, moving the entire machinery of government away from danger, while ordinary Londoners stayed behind to face it directly. Danger then as now was never quite as democratic as it liked to appear on paper, and yet even inside that 40-day isolation, neighbours still found small quiet ways to reach each other. Food and supplies were often left outside a marked door rather than abandoned entirely, someone knocking once and stepping well back before a hand reached out to collect it. Church bells tolled so often during the worst weeks that some residents complained of the constant ringing still carried a strange kind of comfort, alongside their grim purpose, a reminder that the rest of the parish had not simply forgotten the people shut away behind those red-painted doors. Isolation, even at its most severe, rarely meant total abandonment. That number, 40 days, was not chosen by accident, and it carries a small piece of history worth pausing on. Long before England ever wrote its own plague orders, the trading city of Venice had already been wrestling with exactly this problem for centuries, holding incoming ships offshore for a set period, before allowing anyone to step onto land just in case sickness was quietly travelling in the hold. Over time, that waiting period settled on 40 days, specifically called in the local tongue 40 giorni. You have almost certainly guessed already where this is going. That very phrase, worn down over centuries of use across different languages, eventually became the English word quarantine, a word we were all suddenly using again ourselves with real urgency, several centuries after Elizabeth's own council first put a version of it into practice. Enforcing all of this and simply keeping track of who had died and why fell to a group of people, history is mostly forgotten, and I think that needs correcting. Parishes across London hired searchers, almost always poor older women, to visit houses where a death had occurred and examine the body closely enough to determine what had actually killed them. It was grim, dangerous, poorly paid work carrying real risk of exposure with essentially no protection beyond whatever caution the searcher herself chose to take. Many of these women were widows themselves taking on work. Few others in the parish were willing to touch, often shunned by their own neighbours afterward, simply for having walked through so many doors marked with a red cross. And yet their findings week after week were compiled into official documents called Bills of Mortality, published openly so that anyone in the city could see exactly how many people had died recently and from what. It was in its own rough, imperfect way, one of the earliest attempts anywhere in the world at genuine public health data, built entirely on the unglamorous, largely unpaid labour of women nobody thought to record the names of. The numbers those women helped gather still have the power to stop you cold even centuries later. During an outbreak in 1563, London lost somewhere around 17,000 people, nearly 15 out of every 100 residents in the entire city in a single terrible stretch. 3 decades later, during another severe outbreak, the death toll climbed past 15,000 within the city walls alone, with several thousand more in the parishes crowded just outside them. I do not share those figures to leave you sitting with something purely heavy tonight. I share them because I think it matters to understand exactly how much real courage sat underneath every single measure we have talked about so far. The watchmen, the searchers, the families sealed behind their own front doors for 40 long days at a stretch, all of them doing their absolute best against something they could not see, could not fully explain, and could not entirely stop. Ordinary people, of course, did not simply wait passively for official orders to protect them. You already know from earlier in this very story that a Tudor lady might carry a small pomander of sweet herbs against the bad air she believed was drifting through a crowded street. That same instinct showed up everywhere once plague arrived in a town. Houses were fumigated with smoke from burning rosemary or juniper, filling a room with enough sharp, fragrant smoke to drive out whatever corrupted air might be lingering in the corners, until the wood beams themselves carried the smell for days afterward. Streets sometimes saw bonfires lit at busy crossroads, for the exact same reason entire neighbourhoods sitting inside a haze of burning herbs each evening, hoping the smoke itself might scrub the air clean before nightfall. Merchants sometimes required coins to be dropped into a small bowl of vinegar before a transaction was completed, believing the sharp liquid could strip away whatever invisible sickness might be clinging to the metal, the sour smell of it hanging over market stalls right alongside the usual scent of bread and livestock. None of it worked in quite the way anyone believed it did, and yet oddly enough quite a lot of it worked anyway, just not for the reason anyone in that room could have told you at the time. That contradiction is worth sitting with for a moment, because I think it is the real heart of this entire part of the story. Miasma theory was wrong about the mechanism. Bad smells were never the actual cause of plague, but foul-smelling places were very often truly dangerous anyway, simply because filth, crowding and stagnant water happened to be exactly where fleas, rats and the bacteria they carried thrived best. So when Tudor authorities pushed people to avoid foul air, clear away refuse and keep their distance from crowded, unclean spaces, they were quite by accident pushing people toward many of the exact same behaviours we now know actually slow the spread of disease. Wrong theory, right instinct. It is one of my favourite quiet lessons buried anywhere in this whole story, because it shows you do not always need the correct explanation to stumble onto the correct response, provided you are paying careful enough attention to what keeps working and humble enough to keep doing it. That same instinct pushed authorities to shut down exactly the sort of places where large crowds packed themselves in tightly together for hours at a stretch. London's playhouses, theatres that would later stage some of the most famous plays in the English language were repeatedly closed by official order whenever weekly deaths climbed past a certain threshold, since a few thousand people, breathing shoulder to shoulder inside one wooden building, seemed even without any concept of airborne infection like an obviously poor idea during an outbreak. Entertainment simply paused sometimes for months at a stretch, until the numbers finally began to fall again. I think about those watchmen sometimes standing outside a marked door for 40 straight days in every kind of weather, guarding neighbours they likely knew by name, torn between simple human duty and a very real fear for their own safety. I think about the searchers walking from house to house through the worst of it, examining the dead so that the living might understand even a little what they were facing. None of them had the comfort of knowing with any real certainty whether what they were doing would actually work. They did it anyway because waiting helplessly felt worse than trying something, even an imperfect something built on the best understanding available to them, That more than any red cross or vinegar-soaked coin might be the part of this story I find most worth carrying with you. Fear left completely unanswered tends to curdle into paralysis, but fear channeled into careful, consistent action, even action built on an incomplete map of the actual danger, gave an entire frightened city something to hold on to besides helplessness. They could not see the enemy clearly. They organized against it anyway together, street by street, door by door. I find myself thinking honestly about how much of what any of us do in a genuine crisis comes down to exactly that same trade choosing to act on the best available understanding, knowing full well it might later turn out to be incomplete, simply because doing something thoughtful still beats doing nothing at all. Tudor London did not have the full picture. It had careful observation, real community effort, and enough collective discipline to follow through on measures nobody could fully prove would work. That combination, as it turns out, carried them further than you might expect, but plague thankfully was not knocking on every door every single day. Most mornings in Tudor England carried no red cross, no watchman, no bowl of vinegar waiting at a market stall. Behind most front doors on a perfectly ordinary morning, an entirely different kind of order was quietly keeping everything running, a whole hidden structure of bells, timetables, and carefully ranked servants, making sure a great household actually functioned. One small task handed from one set of hands to the next from the moment its master woke until the last candle was finally snuffed out at night. Picture for a moment an actual 16th century household of real size, not a cottage but a proper manor house or a nobleman's residence, and you're looking at something nearer to a small self-contained company than a family home in the way we would picture one today. In the grandest households of the era, including the king's own, the entire operation was formally split into two distinct halves, and I love how plainly the Tudors named them. One half was called the household above stairs, concerned entirely with the personal dignity and daily comfort of the lord and his family. The other was called the household below stairs, concerned with the unglamorous, absolutely essential business of food, drink, fuel, and light that kept the whole place actually running. The first was run by the Lord Chamberlain. The second answered to the Lord Steward. Neither man would have dreamed of stepping too far into the other's territory. Even the great officers themselves carried a visible mark of their standing. The three most senior men in the king's own household, the Lord Chamberlain, the Lord Steward, and the Master of the Horse, were each permitted to carry a plain white stick wherever they went about their duties, a small unmistakable signal to everyone else in the building that this particular man answered to nobody but the king himself. You could apparently walk the length of a Tudor palace and know exactly who held real authority, simply by which men were carrying a slim white rod and which were not. The Lord Steward's half of that operation met formally around an actual table, and I mean that literally. Draped across it was a plain length of green cloth, and the group of officials who gathered there each week to review household spending, wages and provisions became known quite simply as the Board of Green Cloth, a name so ordinary and practical it has truly stuck around inside British royal administration in some form for centuries afterward. Sitting on that board alongside the steward were men with titles that sound almost invented. Now a treasurer, a comptroller and a cofferer, whose entire job was making certain every servant in that enormous household actually received the wages they were owed, on time out of a budget that had to stretch across an almost unbelievable number of separate departments. And there were a great many departments to stretch across. Below stairs alone might contain a pantry responsible for bread, cheese, and the household linens laid across the table, run by an officer called a pantler. A separate buttery handled wine, ale and beer, overseen by a butler, a title you still hear today, echoing straight back to a man whose original job was quite literally managing the household's drink supply. The Uri looked after basins, towels, and washing water. A chandlery made and stored every candle the household would burn. A larder preserved meat, while an entirely separate room called the boiling house handled nothing but boiling and sterilizing that same meat, staffed in at least one surviving record by only 3 men working in almost unbroken rotation to keep an entire household fed safely. A laundry, small enough to run on a handful of officers, still somehow managed to wash every piece of linen belonging to both the Uri and the grander wardrobe above stairs, an entire household's clean shirts and bedding passing through the hands of the very same overworked few. Can I ask you something? Doesn't that sound remarkably near to how a modern company actually runs departments, budgets, a formal board reviewing expenses, specific titles for specific functions, everyone reporting somewhere further up a very clear chain? We tend to imagine Tudor households as simple rustic places a lord, his family, and a handful of loyal helpers. The reality, at least for anyone with real wealth, looked nearer to a small, highly organized corporation, with its own internal bureaucracy quietly running underneath every feast, every hunting party, and every quiet evening by the fire. The scale of some of these operations truly surprised me the first time I saw the actual numbers. Records from the middle of the Tudor period show nearly 290 separate people working under the Lord Steward's authority alone inside a single great household, before you even begin counting the entirely separate staff answering to the chamberlain above stairs. 290 people each with a specific title, a specific task, and a specific place in a chain of command, all quietly working to keep one household fed, clothed, lit, and running smoothly day after day, whether their lord ever noticed their names or not. That chain of command was not entirely fixed in stone either, which I find worth mentioning. A sharp, reliable boy who started out turning a spit in the kitchen at 10 years old might, given enough time, enough loyalty, and a fair amount of good fortune, work his way up through the ranks of that same below-stairs world, eventually overseeing younger servants himself. It was slow, unglamorous progress built entirely on years of proven trustworthiness, rather than birth or education, but it was real progress all the same, one of the very few paths available to an ordinary person hoping to rise even slightly above the position they'd been born into. One office in particular deserves a moment of its own because it connects directly to something we touched on earlier in this very story. Do you remember the stale bread trenchers used instead of plates at a Tudor table? Those trenchers soaked through with meat juices and gravy by the end of a meal were rarely simply thrown away. In a well-run household, an official called the almoner was specifically responsible for collecting these leftover trenchers, along with whatever other food remained after the household had eaten, and distributing it to the poor waiting at the gate. The word itself comes from the same root as alms, meaning charitable giving, and the role carried real religious weight in a period that took the obligation to feed the hungry seriously, at least on paper. A lord's own leftover dinner quite literally became someone else's meal that same evening, passed hand to hand through an office built specifically to make sure it happened. Picture it for a moment. The scraps of a feast still warm carried out through a side door, while laughter and music carried on inside handed quietly into the waiting hands of people the household would never invite to sit at its own table, yet still felt some genuine obligation not to let go hungry. Order inside the household walls was one thing. Order outside them relied on a system I find almost startling once you understand how it actually worked, because it placed the burden of law enforcement squarely on ordinary neighbours rather than any professional police force, since nothing resembling modern policing existed anywhere in England yet. If you witnessed a crime, a theft, an assault, anything serious enough to alarm you, the law required you to raise what was called the hue and cry. shouting loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, and the moment they heard it, every able-bodied person within earshot was legally obligated to drop whatever they were doing and join the chase. Refusing to help could bring a fine down on your own head. This was not some quaint fading custom by the Tudor period either. Parliament actively reaffirmed and updated the rules around hue and cry in the 1580s, well within Elizabeth's own reign, treating it as a living, functioning part of how the entire country kept the peace, centuries after the practice first took shape under earlier medieval kings. There was no professional police force anywhere in England to hand that responsibility off to instead. Keeping the peace was quite literally everybody's job, whether they had volunteered for it or not. Try to picture it honestly for a moment. A thief snatches something in a crowded market, and within seconds half the street is shouting and running after him. Shopkeepers, farmers, children, whoever happened to be standing nearest, all legally bound to give chase together. A baker drops his tray mid-delivery. A farmer abandons his cart halfway across the square. Nobody stops to ask whether chasing a stranger through crowded lanes was convenient or safe, or even their business. The law had already decided that for them the moment the cry went up, there was no waiting for an officer to arrive. The community simply was the police force in that particular moment, whether any individual person felt like volunteering for the job or not. All of this above stairs and below inside the gate and out in the street ran according to one final piece of quiet, invisible machinery, the bell. A great household rose at, worked and rested according to a strict schedule of bells, rung throughout the day, calling servants to their duties, signalling when the kitchens needed to have dinner ready, marking the hours for prayer, for cleaning, for the endless small tasks that kept everything functioning smoothly. A kitchen boy learned the sound of his own particular bell, the way a modern worker learns the buzz of a particular notification instantly, almost without thinking, his whole day quietly organised around a rhythm he had no say in setting. No servant needed a clock of their own. The entire household simply moved together one bell at a time, an enormous coordinated machine built almost entirely out of human hands, human feet, and a shared understanding of exactly what each particular ring meant. Can I ask you something else while we're on the subject? How different is that really from an office today quietly organised around calendar alerts and meeting notifications instead of bells, each one just as invisible to an outsider and just as absolute to the person whose entire day still bends around it? I think about all of this honestly, and what strikes me most is not the grandeur sitting at the very top of it, the Lord in his finest chamber, the feast laid out below the salt and above it. It is everyone else, the pantler, the butler, the boiling house, men the almoner quietly filling a basket at the gate. The 289 other names history never bothered writing down. An entire, elegant, comfortable way of life rested completely on their labour, their timing, their willingness to answer a bell at whatever hour it happened to ring. We remember the name of the house. We rarely remember the hands that actually kept it standing, and that seems worth correcting, even just for the length of one evening story. That more than any single office or title feels like the real lesson tucked inside this whole hidden structure. Grandeur has never once managed itself. It has always required an enormous, quiet, mostly invisible machine running underneath it, and the people operating that machine deserve at least a small share of the credit history so rarely thinks to give them. The next time you walk into a beautifully kept building, a hotel, a restaurant, an office lobby, polished to perfection before you ever arrived, it might be worth remembering that someone somewhere behind a door you will never open answered a bell of their own to make that moment feel effortless for you. But even the most perfectly organised household with its bells, its offices and its neatly balanced green cloth ledgers existed in service of one plain truth. Nobody in Tudor England ever tried particularly hard to hide from. Every single person inside that great house, from the lord in his finest chamber, down to the youngest boy turning a spit in the kitchen, was living on borrowed time. The steward who balanced the accounts, the almoner who filled the basket at the gate, the boy who might one day rise to oversee the very kitchen he started in. All of them understood in a way most of us go to considerable lengths to avoid thinking about that. The bell ringing to call them to supper tonight would someday ring for an entirely different reason. It was a world that thought about death far more openly and far more carefully than most of us ever allow ourselves to now, and I think there is real wisdom waiting for us in exactly how they chose to think about it. There was an entire literary tradition built around exactly this idea, and it had a name, ars moriendi, which simply means the art of dying. It first took shape on the continent in the wake of the Black Death, when an entire generation had watched death arrive so suddenly so often that people badly wanted some kind of guide for facing it well rather than in panic or despair. By the year 1490, England's very first printer, a man named William Caxton, had already produced an English translation, meaning that by the time the Tudors took the throne only a few years later, this way of thinking about death was not some obscure academic idea. It was sitting on shelves being recited aloud in households treated as practical, useful instruction, the same way you might pick up a guide to any other skill worth learning properly. And dying well, according to this tradition, really was treated as a skill one with specific challenges to prepare for in advance. The text described 5 particular temptations a person might face in their final hours: a sudden lack of faith, a wave of despair, impatience with the pain, and waiting a flash of pride in one's own righteousness, and a last stubborn grip on worldly attachments, money-land grudges left unsettled. Illustrated editions even pictured these temptations directly small woodcut scenes, showing demons crowding around a dying man's bed, offering him crowns, coins, and false comfort, while an angel and a small gathering of saints stood quietly on the other side, waiting for him to choose which voice to trust in his final moments. It reads almost like a battle plan, honestly a map of exactly which doubts might ambush you when you were at your weakest, handed out in advance, so you would recognize them the moment they arrived. Family and friends gathered at the bedside were given their own instructions, 2 specific prayers to offer specific comfort to provide, turning the deathbed itself into a shared, almost rehearsed moment, rather than something faced entirely alone. Can I ask you something? Honestly. When was the last time you actually thought in any real detail about how you would want your own final hours to go, who you would want in the room, what you would want left unsaid or finally said out loud? I think most of us push that question so far away that we never really answer it at all, and I am not sure that avoidance serves us nearly as well as we assume it does. That same careful, deliberate attention showed up in one of the most ordinary documents a Tudor person could produce, their will. And here is something that always catches me a little off guard. Almost every surviving Tudor will, rich or modest, opens the exact same way long before a single possession is mentioned. In the name of God, Amen. The very first bequest listed was never a piece of land or a favourite ring or a sum of money. It was the soul itself, formally, deliberately handed over to God's keeping, as though settling one's spiritual accounts came before settling anything material at all. Even the opening line carried more history inside it than you might expect. Wills written earlier in the century under the old Catholic faith often called specifically on the Virgin Mary and a whole company of saints to intercede on the dying person's behalf. Naming particular saints, a family had always felt some personal devotion toward, almost like calling on old trusted friends to speak up on your behalf before a final judgment. But as the Reformation swept through England and reshaped what people were taught to believe about salvation, that same opening line quietly changed too. Later wills written under the new Reformed Church tend to speak far more plainly, committing the soul simply and directly to God with no saints mentioned at all. You can truly watch an entire religious revolution unfold one ordinary paragraph at a time just by reading how different Tudor families chose to open their final written words across a single turbulent century. Once the soul was accounted for, the rest of a Tudor will turn to something wonderfully specific and often surprisingly personal. Wealthier testators frequently set aside a particular sum of money for one specific purpose, buying mourning rings for a carefully chosen list of friends and family. These were not simple decorations. Each ring was meant to be engraved with the name of the person who had died. Sometimes the date, sometimes a short phrase reminding the wearer of their own mortality, occasionally set with a small dark stone black jet, where a family could afford it, chosen specifically because it looked nothing like the bright celebratory jewels worn on any other occasion. The whole point was that every single time a friend slipped that ring onto their finger, for years afterward they would think just for a moment of the person who had given it, and of the fact that their own turn would come eventually too. It sounds almost heavy to modern ears, I know, and yet I find something quietly beautiful in it as well. A person planning with real care exactly how they wanted to remain present in the lives of the people they loved long after they themselves were gone. The wider community had its own way of marking a death, one built entirely out of sound rather than sight, and it is worth understanding because it tells you something about how differently news travelled in a world without newspapers or telephones. When someone lay dying, the parish church rang what was called the passing bell, alerting the whole village to pray for a soul about to depart. Once death actually came, the bells rang again differently this time, and here is the detail I find truly remarkable. The pattern of ringing itself told you who had died before anyone said a single word out loud. 3 sets of 3 strikes for a man, 2 sets of 3 for a woman, and then after a pause 1 single toll for every year of that person's life, counted out slowly enough that anyone standing in a nearby field or kitchen could work out purely by listening and counting roughly who in the parish had just passed away and roughly how long they had lived. Try to picture that for a moment. An entire village going about an ordinary afternoon, suddenly pausing at the sound of a distant bell, counting silently under their breath, piecing together a small quiet tragedy purely through rhythm and repetition, long before any formal announcement ever reached them directly. Death in Tudor England was never something whispered about behind closed doors. It rang out literally across open fields for absolutely everyone to hear. Can I ask you something before we finish this whole story together? Of everything we have walked through tonight, which single detail has stayed with you the most, sitting somewhere in the back of your mind, refusing to quite let go? I have my own favourite, and I suspect it changes depending on which night you ask me. Think back for just a moment over everything this one long night has carried us through together. A room that never fully slept through until morning, trusting the dark rather than fearing it. A cup of something other than water, quietly protecting an entire kingdom for reasons nobody in it actually understood. A single change of linen doing the work we now hand over to soap and running water. A colour on someone's back announcing exactly where they stood in the world before they ever said a single word. A table laid with more unspoken rules than most modern courtrooms. A face painted pale with something slowly working against the very beauty it was meant to protect. A vein of blood let loose to restore a balance nobody could see. A hand clasped tightly in a promise the law itself was willing to enforce. a room that belonged for one fierce month entirely to women. A red cross on a door and a whole city organising itself round a fear it could not fully name. 290 quiet hands keeping one household standing without ever once being thanked for it. And now, finally a bell tolling out a life one careful strike at a time for a village that already understood exactly who it had lost. I think what strikes me most, having spent this whole story with you, is how consistently this same instinct shows up over and over in every single part of Tudor life we've explored together tonight. They faced their world honestly working with whatever knowledge, whatever tools, whatever faith they actually had, rather than pretending difficult things were not real, simply because facing them plainly felt uncomfortable. They did not flinch away from the length of the night, or the water they could not fully trust, or the sickness they could not fully explain, or the ending that waited eventually for every single one of them. They built rituals, language, and quiet daily habits around all of it, instead turning fear into something they could actually examine, and slowly learn to carry alongside them. That more than any single fact we've covered tonight feels like the true gift hiding inside this whole story. Not the strange habits themselves, fascinating as they are, but the steady, patient courage sitting underneath every single one of them. A willingness to look plainly at whatever felt frightening, and to keep building a decent, thoughtful life directly alongside it anyway. I think that willingness might be the one true thread connecting every single person we have met tonight. A queen worrying over her own reflection, a barber holding a blade over a trusting arm, a midwife swearing an oath before a bishop, a servant answering a bell before dawn, a whole village counting the strikes of a distant bell. None of them had the answers we have now. All of them kept going anyway, choosing again and again to face an uncertain world with whatever quiet dignity they could manage. I find that far more impressive than any crown, any title, any grand portrait hanging in a palace hallway. So if you find yourself lying awake again tonight somewhere in the small quiet hours we spent time with right at the very beginning of this story, I hope you carry a little of that same steadiness with you into the dark. The candle has burned low, the bells have gone quiet, and somewhere centuries away, an entire world of people once closed their eyes in exactly this same kind of darkness, trusting as best they could that morning would come again the same way you are trusting it now, whether you realize it or not. There is something quietly comforting in that, I think, if you let yourself sit with it for just a moment longer. Every single person in tonight's story eventually laid their head down for the very last time, in a room not so very different from your own, in a darkness not so very different from the one settling around you right now. And every single one of them in their own way found some quiet peace, with that built out of ritual faith community and the simple stubborn decision to keep living well until the very last bell finally rang for them too. Thank you so sincerely for spending this time with me tonight, drifting through an entire Tudor lifetime together, one strange, human, surprisingly familiar habit at a time. If any small piece of tonight's story stayed with you, I would love to hear which part it was, so please do leave it down in the comments before you drift off completely. And if this kind of quiet, honest history helped ease you towards sleep tonight, know that it means more to me than you probably realize. And if you are still here with me, still awake, still listening, I hope you will come back and find me again soon, because there is always another quiet corner of history waiting to be uncovered, another story ready to be told softly the next time you need somewhere gentle to rest your mind. Sleep well, my friend. I will be right here waiting whenever you're ready to wander back into the past together again.